Chapter 32, The Hard Case. The second case arrived on a Wednesday in the second week of April, which meant it arrived in the middle of a school day, which meant Mira handled the initial intake and had a full summary waiting on the territory's working table by the time he reached the forest that afternoon. He read it standing. He sat down to read it a second time. The case was not complicated in structure. It was complicated in weight. A half-blooded Yukai woman named Chio, living in the satellite city northeast of Ko, had been formally accused by the local Yukai Community Council of fraudulently claiming heritage status that entitled her to community resource access. The accusation was not new. It had been running for 3 years, built through an accumulation of petitions and counter-filings and bureaucratic challenges that had the character of something designed to exhaust rather than to resolve. The council's position was that Chio's human ancestry was sufficient to disqualify her from certain protected community categories. Chio's position was that the same heritage had been recognized as qualifying for 11 years before a change in council leadership reinterpreted the applicable criteria. The complication, the thing that made Myra's expression careful and her summary unusually long, was what had happened in the 3 years since the accusation began. Chio had lost her access to the community's resource-sharing network, which was the primary means by which lower-income members of the Yukai community supplemented what human economy wages could not cover. She had lost her housing subsidy. Her child, 7 years old and half Yukai, had been informally excluded from the community school that was the only educational setting in the area equipped to handle children with non-human characteristics. The child's name was Hannah. Hannah was attending a standard public school with no support infrastructure, concealing her non-human characteristics every day with a child's version of glamour that was, Myra's summary noted, remarkable for its consistency and exhausting for its cost. He set down the summary. The council, he said, has formal standing in the Yukai Council's regional structure, Mira said. She was at the table across from him, her tea untouched. The case technically falls under the council's jurisdiction. The reason it has come to us is because the Council's formal procedures have been used as the mechanism of the exclusion. The filing system that should have resolved this in 3 months has been deliberately kept open for 3 years by parties who understand how to use administrative complexity as a weapon. The same thing Reiser tried with the legal letters, he said. Yes. The same principle at a different scale and with a different kind of harm. He thought about Kira, 7 years of moving. He thought about Chio's child, 7 years old, holding a glamour every day at school because the space that should have held her completely did not exist. What does Chio want? He asked. Resolution of the heritage question. Not revenge, not damages. She wants her daughter to be able to go to a school that knows what she is. And we can provide that. We can provide the neutral facilitation that cuts through the administrative complexity and produces a binding determination that the Council's existing procedures cannot override. Mira paused. We cannot provide it quickly. This will take longer than 11 days. The administrative record is 3 years deep, and the Council's leadership will resist any outside determination of jurisdiction. How will they resist? By questioning Kamaribi's authority to adjudicate inter-community heritage disputes. The Yukai Council regional structure does not formally recognize Kamaribi's neutral standing as extending to their jurisdictional categories. He thought about this. He thought about Shibata's unofficial note. I have been watching your territory for 6 months. You are doing this correctly. The correctly part is not common. Shibata, he said. Mira looked at him. Shibata asked about intra-Yukai disputes. He knows the Council's procedures are being used as a weapon. He sent the unofficial note separately from the formal acknowledgement because he wanted me to know that he personally recognized the situation. He looked at the summary. He wants this resolved. He doesn't have the formal authority to intervene in the Council's own procedures. But I might. You would need to establish that Kamaribi's neutral standing extends to heritage determinations that existing community procedures have demonstrably failed to process fairly, Mira said. That is an argument. It is not yet settled law. Is it a good argument? It is the argument Surzex's recognition implicitly supports. The recognized independent territory framework was designed precisely for situations where existing procedures are inadequate. Whether any specific decision-maker will accept that reading depends on who the decision-maker is. I'll call Shibata. Before you do, Mira said, you should understand what taking this case means for the territory's public profile. The Phoenix matter was internal to Devil Society. This case involves the Yukai Council, which is a different political ecosystem with different sensitivities and different potential consequences. Taking it and winning builds Kamaribi's credibility across a second major supernatural category. Taking it and losing, or taking it and handling it poorly, creates a precedent of overreach that all three major factions can cite. I know. I want to be sure you know. The child is 7, he said. She's holding a glamour every day. That's the weight of the case, and it exceeds the weight of the political risk. Mira was quiet for a moment. Then she reached for her tea, which had gone cold, and drank it anyway. Call Shibata, she said. Chapter 33, Shibata. Shibata was a Kappa of approximately 300 years, which in Kappa terms meant he was mid-career, past the first century of establishing credibility but well short of the accumulated authority that came with another century or two of consistent work. He had the characteristic Kappa build, compact and dense, and the characteristic Kappa manner of expressing skepticism through the precise phrasing of questions rather than through direct disagreement. It was a style of engagement that could be mistaken for evasion by people who didn't understand it, and that was, once understood, one of the more honest communication approaches Issei had encountered in the supernatural world. They met at a tea shop near the city's northern administrative district, which was Shibata's suggestion and which told him something. Shibata wanted the meeting on ground that was demonstrably neutral but within his operational area, where he had visibility, and where his presence would not read as an unusual event. Issei arrived with Mira. He had considered arriving alone and decided against it. Mira's presence communicated that Kamaribi was a functioning institution with staff rather than a single individual operating on personal initiative, and that framing was important for what he was about to propose. Shibata was already at the table. He looked at Mira with recognition. Mira Issei, he said. I have heard your name from 3 different sources in the past month. The supernatural world is smaller than it appears, Mira said, sitting down with the ease of someone for whom unfamiliar meetings were simply familiar meetings that had not happened yet. What are the sources saying? Issei asked. That Kamaribi has attracted serious capabilities. Shibata looked at him. They say it with varying degrees of wariness, depending on the source. The wary ones are wary because serious capabilities in a neutral territory are unpredictable. The approving ones are approving because the supernatural world has needed serious neutral capabilities for a very long time. And you? I am a bureaucrat, Shibata said, with the flat delivery of someone stating a fact that was also a professional philosophy. I believe in institutions that function as intended. The Yukai Council's regional procedures are intended to protect community members from arbitrary exclusion. They are currently being used to accomplish the opposite. A pause. I cannot act on that directly without causing a political disruption whose secondary effects would harm the people I am trying to protect. This is the fundamental problem of working within a system that has been partially captured by interests opposed to its stated purpose. Which is why you wrote the unofficial note. Which is why I wrote the unofficial note. He looked at his tea. You asked about intra-Yukai disputes. I assumed you had a specific case in mind. I have been waiting to see which one. Chio and her daughter Hana. Shibata's expression did not change in any obvious way. But something behind it settled, the specific quality of someone whose working hypothesis has been confirmed. 3 years, he said. 3 years, Issei agreed. The child is 7. She's managing a daily glamour in a school with no support infrastructure because the community school that has that infrastructure has informally excluded her. The exclusion is not formal, Shibata said. It cannot be formally challenged because it is not formally documented. This is deliberate. I know. What I need to understand from you is the legal landscape. Specifically, does Kamaribi's neutral standing under the Underworld Recognition Framework give me grounds to make a heritage determination in a case the Yukai Council's procedures have demonstrably failed to process fairly? Shibata was quiet for a long time. He turned his teacup 1 full rotation. The Yukai Council's charter predates the Underworld's post-war regional settlement by several centuries, he said. The settlement's framework for recognized independent territory is therefore theoretically subordinate to the Council's jurisdictional claims within its own community categories. He turned the cup again. However, the settlement's framework includes a provision, Section 17, which establishes that any party with neutral standing may intervene in a jurisdictional matter when three conditions are met. First, the affected party has exhausted available remedies within the existing jurisdiction. Second, the case involves harm to a minor. Third, the existing jurisdiction's procedures demonstrate a pattern of outcome inconsistency with stated purpose. He said it the way he said everything, in the flat delivery of someone stating facts. But the facts themselves were very specific and arrived in a very specific order. Issei looked at him. You have read Section 17 recently, he said. I review relevant framework provisions regularly, Shibata said. It is part of my work. All three conditions are met in this case. All three conditions are met in this case, Shibata confirmed. The Council's leadership will contest the Section 17 application. They will argue that the remedies have not been exhausted, that the procedural delays are within acceptable administrative variation, and that the pattern of outcomes reflects legitimate interpretive evolution of the heritage criteria rather than capture. Those are weak arguments. They are arguments a well-resourced party can sustain through procedural objection for a significant period of time. Shibata paused. Unless the party applying Section 17 has sufficient standing, that sustained objection becomes politically costly. Surzex's recognition. The Lucifer family's direct involvement in Kamaribi's recognition creates a political cost structure for anyone who wants to challenge its authority aggressively. He picked up his cup. The Council's leadership will make the calculation. If they determine that the political cost of resistance exceeds the benefit of maintaining the exclusion, they will capitulate. If they determine otherwise, you will have a fight. How do I influence that calculation? By making the case publicly enough that the cost of resistance becomes visible. Shibata set down his cup. The Council's leadership derives their authority from the community they represent. If the community can see clearly what the leadership is protecting and what it is sacrificing to protect it, the political math changes. That means Chio needs to be willing to be visible, Mira said. That means Chio needs to be willing to be visible, Shibata agreed. Issei thought about a woman who had been managing a 3-year administrative siege and had, at the end of it, written to every supernatural entity with neutral standing she could find. He thought about the nature of that action, the combination of exhaustion and refusal to stop that it required. She'll be willing, he said. Then I will provide the formal notation of Section 17's applicability from within the Council's own administrative system, Shibata said. Not as support for Kamaribi's claim. As a matter of accurate record, which is my function. He looked at Issei over the rim of his cup. I cannot be seen to be working against the Council's leadership. I can be seen to be doing my job correctly. That's enough, Issei said. It will have to be. They finished their tea. Walking back through the city's northern streets, Mira said, he has been waiting for this case for a long time. I know, Issei said. He built the argument for us. He just needed a party with standing to use it. That is, Mira said, exactly how institutional change works in slow-moving systems. Someone within the system prepares the ground. Someone outside the system with sufficient standing makes the move. The ground determines whether the move holds. He thought about the camphor tree's roots, filtering water upstream for 1,000 years, changing the soil chemistry of an area long before anyone came to steward it. The ground has been prepared for a long time in some of these cases, he said. Yes, Mira said. It has. Chapter 34, Chio. He went alone to meet Chio. This was a considered choice. Mira's presence communicated institutional weight, which was useful in a meeting with Shibata and would have been counterproductive here. What Chio needed from this first meeting was not to be processed by an institution. She had been processed by institutions for 3 years. She needed to understand, from a person rather than from an entity, what Kamaribi was and whether it was worth the risk of visibility that Shibata had correctly identified as the case's hinge. She lived in a residential neighborhood northeast of the city center, in a second-floor apartment in a building that was clean and well-maintained and showed the specific upkeep of someone who had learned that the appearance of stability was itself a form of protection. The management of surfaces to communicate normalcy was something he recognized from Kira's months of glamour work and from everything Nix had taught him about camouflage, as a survival practice rather than a deception. Chio answered the door with the expression of someone who had been expecting a visit they had calculated the risks of accepting, and had decided to accept anyway. She was in her early 30s by human appearance, with the Yukai ancestry visible in the bone structure, and in the faint luminescence at the corners of her eyes that her daughter had inherited in a stronger form. She was compact and precise in her movements, and she looked at him with the kind of directness that came from having spent 3 years in a situation where there was no longer any benefit to ambiguity. "You're younger than I expected," she said. "I get that often," he said. "May I come in?" The apartment was small and extremely organized, the organization of a space that was functioning as both home and administrative office for a multi-year legal defense. A section of the main wall held a timeline of the case in handwritten notation, every filing and counter-filing and procedural response, color-coded in a system that was immediately legible to him as the work of someone who had been managing complex information under cognitive load for an extended period. He looked at the wall without commenting on it. It said everything it needed to say. Chio made tea with the efficiency of someone for whom hospitality was a practice rather than a gesture. She set 2 cups on the low table and sat across from him with her hands folded and her posture very straight. "Tell me what Kamaribi is," she said. "Not the formal description. What it actually is." He thought about how to answer this honestly in terms that would be meaningful to someone who had been processed by formal structures for 3 years. "It's a forest in Eastern Ko," he said. "A camphor tree that's been there for 1,000 years. A beetle on my shoulder. An arachne who lived alone for 40 years before she found a space to build what she'd been wanting to build. A lamia whose community was destroyed and who has been without ground since. A chimera who moved for 7 years without stopping." He paused. "It's a place where things that don't fit the existing categories can exist completely. Not hidden, not apologizing, not managing themselves down to something the categories can accept." Chio was quiet. "Hannah," she said. The word had the quality of the most important thing said simply. "Yes," he said. "She holds the glamour every morning without being asked. She started doing it herself when she was 5. I didn't teach her. She learned it because she could feel that the school environment required it, and she decided that fitting in was worth the cost." A pause that held something enormous in it. "She's 7. The cost should not be hers to pay." "No," he said. "It shouldn't. What does Kamaribi need from me?" "Visibility. The Section 17 application requires that the pattern of harm be publicly documented in a way the Council can't administratively suppress. That means you have to be willing to have your case heard outside the Council's own procedures, which means the Council will know you've gone outside, which means the informal pressures that have been running alongside the formal ones may intensify before they reduce." She nodded once, with the quality of someone who had already walked through this calculation before he arrived. "How long?" "I don't know exactly. Longer than the first case. The first case was 2 parties who both wanted resolution and couldn't reach it through existing channels. This case has a party that does not want resolution. Fighting a party that benefits from the absence of resolution takes longer." "Will you win?" He looked at her directly. "I don't know. I think we have a strong legal basis and a significant political advantage because of Kamaribi's recognition. But I'm not going to tell you certainty I don't have." She held his gaze. "The last person who promised me certainty was the Council's previous mediator, who told me the process would be resolved in 3 months, and then disappeared from his post shortly afterward. I'm not promising certainty. I'm promising that Kamaribi will pursue this to the end of the available process, that we won't withdraw because it becomes politically inconvenient, and that the case's merit will be the basis of our argument, and not a tool for achieving something else." "Why?" she asked. Not skepticism. Genuine inquiry. He thought about Myra's instruction. The steward's willingness to take hard cases before they feel fully ready. He thought about Nix's mother's community. He thought about Kira, 7 years old in a different but recognizable sense, a child learning that the world's existing structures did not have room for what she was. "Because Hannah is 7, he said, "and that is sufficient reason." Chia looked at him for a long moment. "When do we start?" she said. Chapter 35, The Council's Response. The formal Section 17 notice was filed on a Monday morning through the Issei Council's administrative system, using the procedural pathway that Shibata had quietly ensured remained technically accessible. It arrived at the Council's regional headquarters with the Kamaribi territorial seal, the underworld recognition notation, and 3 pages of attached documentation identifying each of the 3 Section 17 conditions with their supporting evidence. The Council's response took 4 days, which was faster than Mira had predicted and slower than Shibata had hoped, and its character was exactly what they had prepared for: a multi-point challenge to jurisdiction, a secondary challenge to the documentation's evidentiary standards, and a third challenge arguing that Section 17's harm to minor provision was not applicable because the minor was not a formal party to the dispute. The third challenge was the most aggressive and the weakest legally, because it required the Council to argue that Hannah's school exclusion was not a consequence of the heritage dispute, which required them to sever a causal connection that 3 years of documentary record made very difficult to sever. It was the argument of a party that had run out of strong arguments, and was using weak ones to buy time. He and Mira worked through the response at the shelters table over 2 evenings, Mira drafting and he reviewing and refining, the work moving with the quality of 2 people who had developed a working rhythm over 3 months of increasing complexity. The shelter was warm in the April evenings and the territory's nighttime sounds were familiar by now, the specific calls of the hawk family settling, the tanuki's ongoing commentary, the soft movements of the kitsune who had developed a habit of sitting near the table when work was happening, as if the concentration in the space was something they found worth being close to. Kin sat on the table's edge on the second evening, and watched Myra's pen with the focused amber gaze of a kitsune deciding whether an object was interesting enough to interact with. Mira did not look up from the document. If that tail touches my draft I will have opinions. Kin's tail retracted approximately 4 inches. The third challenge, Issei said, steering the meeting back. They're asking us to prove something that the record already demonstrates. Can we simply submit the record? We can submit the record. The challenge will then shift to questioning the record's admissibility under the Council's evidentiary standards, which we've already addressed in the secondary response. She made a notation. The pattern here is delay. Every challenge they file is designed to add 3 to 6 weeks to the timeline while accomplishing nothing substantively. They are hoping that either we exhaust our tolerance for the process, or Chio exhausts hers. How do we shorten the timeline without overreaching jurisdictionally? We don't shorten it through process. We shorten it by changing the political cost calculation. She set down the pen. Shibata said visibility. We have not yet made full use of that. He thought about this. The Council's community. The Council's community elected the Council's leadership. The leadership derives its mandate from those elections. If the community can see, clearly and in accessible terms, that their leadership has been using community resources and procedures to exclude a long-standing member and a 7-year-old child for 3 years, the political calculus inside the Council changes in ways that do not require us to win every procedural argument. That requires someone to make the case visible. Chio has agreed to visibility. She has documentation and she is articulate, and she has, for 3 years, been maintaining an extremely detailed record of everything that has happened to her family. Mira looked at him. What she does not have is a platform with credibility in the Council's community. What Kamaribi has is the formal recognition and the precedent of the Gore Tanaka resolution, which has been noted in the Council's own administrative records. A public statement, he said, from the steward of Kamaribi, citing the case formally, as an illustration of why neutral facilitation exists. A public statement that is factually accurate, procedurally appropriate, and impossible to characterize as an attack on the Council without the Council having to explain why they object to accurate factual description. He wrote that night. He revised it 3 times. He sent it to Rias, not for approval but as information. She read it and wrote back, "This is the correct move. It will produce a reaction. Be ready." The statement went out through Kamaribi's formal registry channel and through the Issei Council's own community bulletin system, which Shibata had ensured remained technically accessible to registered neutral parties, on a Thursday morning. The reaction came by Friday afternoon. 2 council members publicly dissented from the leadership's handling of the case. One community elder wrote a letter to the regional administrator asking for an independent review. Shibata filed a supplementary administrative notation that characterized the 3 challenges as procedurally irregular under the Council's own case management standards. The Council's leadership responded by requesting an emergency closed session. Mira, reading the notification, said they're trying to move the conversation behind closed doors before the community response develops further momentum. Can they do that? They can convene the session. They cannot require Kamaribi to participate in a closed session when the case involves a public interest determination. We have the right to request an open hearing. Request it, he said. She was already writing. Chapter 36, Kira builds. The case ran in the background of his life the way significant things ran in the background of his life now, present and weighty and requiring regular attention without being the only thing. He had learned, from the territory's first winter, that sustainable effort required the same principle as sustainable ecology, diversification of focus, so that when one area demanded intense engagement, the others could provide the resources that kept the whole system functioning. While the council case moved through its procedural stages, the territory continued its spring development, and Kira continued something she had been working on since March that he had watched with growing attention and had not yet interrupted with questions, because the territory's principle was to let things develop at their own pace, and what she was doing clearly needed to develop at its own pace. She was building something. It had started as sketches in the margins of the structural engineering book, the part-word, part-sketch notation she used for ideas that did not yet have a home in the existing technical vocabulary. The sketches had evolved into a separate notebook, and the notebook had evolved into a cleared section of the forest floor northeast of the shelter, where she had been doing something that was not construction in the conventional sense but was not purely theoretical either. She was building a structural prototype. Small scale, the size of a child's playhouse, but designed with the precision and the material awareness that Sarah had been teaching her since February. The frame was wood from fallen branches, chosen by grain direction and density rather than by size or convenience. The joinery was a hybrid, part the traditional timber framing techniques she had read about in the structural engineering book and part something that did not appear in any book, her own synthesis of what she had learned about load distribution from Sarah and what she understood about natural structure from living as a chimera. From having spent her whole life in a body that had to distribute the weight of wings and human torso and hawk vision across a single coherent system. He sat at the edge of her cleared section one afternoon in late April and watched without speaking. She was fitting a ridgepole with the focused economy she brought to physical work, every movement considered but not slow, the bird-descended precision visible in the way she measured angles by eye rather than by instrument, and was consistently exact. Her wings were half extended for balance without her being aware of them, the amber membrane catching the afternoon light. She fit the ridgepole. She tested its stability. She made a small adjustment at the eastern joint and tested it again, and then stepped back and looked at the whole structure with the expression she wore when evaluating rather than working. He waited. The east-west axis has a flex I don't want, she said, without looking at him. The joinery at the central post is distributing correctly, but the ridgepole's reaction to that distribution is producing a small lateral movement, under load. I need to add a diagonal brace that doesn't interrupt the sight lines. What are the sight lines for? She was quiet for a moment. I have been designing a school, she said. Not for this scale. This is the structural proof of concept. The actual design is for something that can hold 15 children of various species with various non-human characteristics, in a learning environment that does not require any of them to conceal what they are. He looked at the prototype's neat joinery and its careful sight lines and the specific quality of the clearing she had prepared for it, level and oriented to the light. Hannah, he said. And Hannah's situation is not unique, Kira said. I have been thinking about this since you told me about the case. The heritage dispute is the formal mechanism. The underlying reality is that there is no appropriate educational infrastructure for children like Hannah. The existing options are either the specialized community schools that are organized by species and exclude mixed heritage children, or the standard human infrastructure schools that have no capacity for non-human characteristics. The gap between those two categories is full of children who are holding glamours every day and spending their cognitive resources on concealment rather than on learning. She turned from the prototype and looked at him. I want to build a school here, she said. In the territory? Not immediately. The structural work alone will take a year, and the curriculum design will take longer. But the prototype is the beginning. He thought about what Drake had said in December. Territory withstanding changes the structure within which all sanctuaries operate. He thought about what Kira's childhood had been. He thought about what she was building now, with the structural engineering book under her arm and her wings out for balance. 7 years of moving converted into the specific knowledge of what should exist and didn't. What do you need from the territory? He asked. Space, which we have. Structural consultation from Sarah, which she has already offered. She paused. And eventually, if the council case resolves the way you're hoping, a legal framework that allows students from outside the territory to attend without requiring their families to formally affiliate with Kamaribi's jurisdiction. A school that operates under neutral standing, he said. A school that can hold any child who needs it, regardless of what they are. He looked at the prototype again, its careful sight lines designed so that children of different heights and physical configurations could all see clearly. He thought about the level floor, prepared not for the prototype but for the full-scale version she was already designing. Build it, he said. She nodded once, the contained efficient nod she used when a decision had been made, and the next thing was the work. I'll need to talk to Sarah about the ridgepole, she said, and turned back to the prototype with the full attention of someone who had been waiting to begin this for longer than she had known she was waiting. Chapter 37. The Open Hearing. The open hearing was held on a Saturday in early May, in the community center of the Ukai district northeast of Ko, which was the council's jurisdictional territory and was therefore a choice that asserted the council's procedural primacy while being technically compliant with the open hearing requirement. Issei had expected this. Shibata had expected this. Mira had said, when the venue notification arrived, they are reminding us that we are guests in their process. The correct response is to behave as if we are and demonstrate that we don't need home ground advantage. He had dressed for it with the same consideration he would have given to any formal context that required communicating authority through presentation. Not the school uniform, which communicated the wrong kind of identity, and not the gremmery formal wear, which communicated the wrong kind of affiliation. Something clean and without faction markers, which was itself a statement in a room full of people whose clothing would broadcast their community standing. The community center was full. He had not expected that. He had expected the hearing to be attended by the formal parties and a few observers. What he found was a room with every seat taken and people standing at the walls, the council's own community members, some in support of the leadership's position and some clearly not, the latter group visible from the quality of their attention, the forward lean of people who had come to see whether the outcome would match what they had been promised. Chio was already at the table for the applicant party. She looked at him when he entered with the expression she had worn at their first meeting, the combination of exhaustion and resolution that had not resolved in either direction since he had known her. Beside her, sitting at the table's edge in the careful posture of a child who had been briefed on the importance of behavior in formal settings, was Hannah. He had not expected Hannah to be there. He stopped for a moment. Hannah was 7 years old and very small, and her glamour was perfect, not a hair of luminescence visible, not a trace of the Ukai inheritance showing. She sat with her hands folded on the table in the way of a child who had learned to sit very still in formal settings as a protective practice. She was doing it well. It was one of the most profoundly wrong things he had ever seen. He sat down across the table from the council's leadership, which consisted of 4 individuals ranging from 2 centuries to 4 in apparent standing, and he opened his folder and put his hands flat on the table and met the lead council member's gaze with the steadiness he had been practicing since January. We are here under Section 17 of the Post-War Regional Settlement Framework, he said before the opening procedural statements could begin, because the available remedies within the existing jurisdiction have been exhausted, because a minor is directly harmed by the ongoing situation, and because the pattern of outcomes is demonstrably inconsistent with the stated purpose of the procedures being applied. He let that land. Kamaribi has filed the documentation supporting each of these conditions. The Council's challenges to that documentation have been addressed in full. I am prepared to present the case on its merits, and I would like to begin with the third condition, Because I believe the community present today deserves to understand clearly how the procedures they fund and authorize have been used in this case. The lead council member started to object. The regional administrator, sitting to the side in a neutral capacity, raised a hand that was simultaneously polite and non-negotiable. The applicant party has the floor under the open hearing provisions, the administrator said. Issei spoke for 20 minutes. He did not use emotional language. He used the case record, which was 3 years of documented procedural action and outcome, presented in the precise order that made the pattern undeniable without requiring anyone to claim malice, only to observe consequences. He cited every filing, every counter-filing, every administrative delay, every procedural challenge, and what each one had accomplished, and what it had failed to accomplish, and what the gap between those two things meant for Chio's access to community resources and for Hannah's ability to attend a school that could support what she was. He cited Hannah's glamour practice. He cited the age at which she had started it. The room was very quiet during the last part of that. The council's response was competent. Their lead advocate was experienced and organized and made the strongest version of the arguments available to them, which was not a strong version but was handled with professional integrity. He had expected this and had prepared for it, and responded to each point with the documentation that Mira had organized over 3 weeks of preparation. The administrator called a recess at noon. In the corridor, Chio came and stood beside him. She did not say anything. Hannah was on her other side, her hand in her mother's, and she looked up at him with the luminescence now visible at the corners of her eyes, not fully released but less suppressed than it had been inside. "You're the forest person," Hannah said. "Yes," he said. "Mom said the forest is where things can be what they are." "That's right." She considered this with the seriousness of a 7-year-old applying full cognitive resources to a concept. "Can I see it?" "If your mom says it's okay," he said. "Absolutely yes." Chio was looking straight ahead at the corridor wall. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were very bright. "Yes," she said quietly. "She can see it." The hearing resumed. The afternoon session was shorter because the administrator, after the recess, conducted a direct examination of the procedural record that was, in effect, Shibata Section 17 analysis conducted by a party with unimpeachable institutional authority. The examination was not partisan. It was simply a methodical review of whether the council's own procedures had been followed in accordance with their stated purpose. The answer the record produced was, objectively, no. The administrator called for a 48-hour deliberation period and closed the session. Walking out of the community center into the May afternoon, Mira said, "That was well done. The record did most of the work." The record is always doing most of the work. The question is whether anyone reads it clearly. You read it clearly and then read it clearly in public, which is harder than it sounds. He thought about the quiet in the room during the section about Hannah's glamour. About the specific quality of a room full of people recognizing something they had not permitted themselves to fully see before. 48 hours, he said. 48 hours, Mira agreed. We should go back to the territory, and do nothing for at least 12 of them. He thought that was probably correct. Chapter 38, What Nyx Carries. He had known, in the way the map knew things, that something had been building in Nyx for the past several weeks. Not distress. Something more like the accumulation of a thing that had been managed alone for a long time, and was approaching the weight limit of what single-person management could sustain. He did not push. The territory's principle worked in both directions. Voluntary presence meant voluntary sharing. He waited. She came to him on the Sunday before the administrator's decision was due, in the late afternoon when the forest had the golden quality it had in May, the new leaves fully out, and the light coming through them in the specific pattern that had named the territory. She settled at the root beside him without preamble, which was her usual mode of arrival, but there was a quality in the settling that was different from the usual, a deliberateness that communicated intention rather than habit. "I have been thinking about the case," she said. "Which aspect?" "The aspect of a community that exists to protect its members using its own procedures to harm them." She was quiet for a moment. "I know what that looks like from the inside." He waited. "My mother's community was not destroyed in a territorial dispute in the simple sense," she said. "The territorial dispute was the mechanism. The actual destruction was possible because the community had been systematically weakened over 2 decades by exactly the kind of internal exclusion the council case demonstrates. Families of mixed heritage were progressively removed from the resource-sharing network. The young members who left to find opportunities elsewhere were not replaced because the community's definition of membership kept contracting. By the time the external territorial pressure arrived, the community had a fraction of the population and a fraction of the social coherence it had had 20 years before. The evening birdsong moved through the canopy. Maury was still on his shoulder, and Tenny unmoved. "You have never told me this before," he said. "I have been deciding whether it was mine to share," she said. "It involves people who are not here to speak for themselves." A pause. "I think it is relevant. I think it is relevant to the case. And I think it is relevant to what Kamaribi is trying to build, and I think withholding it because of personal caution is a smaller thing than making it available because it is true and useful. What would you like to do with it?" She looked at the camphor tree. "I would like it to be part of Kamaribi's institutional understanding," she said. "Not published. Not cited in formal proceedings. But recorded. In Myra's register. As a case study of what happens when the mechanism of exclusion is internal rather than external. So that when Kamaribi encounters that pattern in the future, the register has a reference for what the pattern looks like in its early stages. I'll ask Mira to do a proper recording if you're willing to talk with her." "I am willing." He looked at her. He had known her since October, 7 months of mornings in the clearing and evenings in the shelter's warmth, and the slow accumulation of the map's reading of her presence, which had always been the warmest of the warmth. She had arrived carrying the weight of a community destroyed and had not set it down in the time he had known her, but had been doing something more complicated than setting it down, integrating it, making it useful, converting loss into the specific kind of knowledge that could prevent the same loss in other contexts. "Nix," he said. "Yes. The community your mother built. The principles she taught. The understanding that the ritual was the tending and the tending was what made things sacred. Those principles are here. In this territory. They're in the way we work and the way we make decisions." She was very still. "I know," she said at last. "I have known for a while. I wanted to wait until I was certain before saying it." "Are you certain now?" She looked at the clearing, at the tanukis in their evening routine, at the silk shelter warm and precise against the treeline, at the kitsune settling for the evening in their preferred positions. "Yes," she said simply. They sat in the evening light until it was fully dark, and the network hummed around them with the warmth of everything that had chosen to be here, and the camphor tree held them the way it had been holding things for 1,000 years, with the patience that was not waiting but was simply the deepest form of presence. Chapter 39, The Decision. The administrator's decision arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Mira read it first because she was at the shelter when the notification came through and he was at school finishing a mathematics examination that had been scheduled before the hearing and that the Gear had no opinion about, and that he had somehow managed to sit through without any visible outward indication of the thing running in the background of his mind. Her message, when he checked his phone between the exam and the next class, was 4 words: "Come when you can." He came after school. He walked through the forest boundary with the particular quality of attention he had when the map was showing him something significant in its near-term future, not dread, the specific quality of a held breath. Mira was at the table with the notification open on the paper in front of her. The rest of the territory's regular morning members were present, which had not been planned and which he understood as the network's version of gathering. Nix at her root. Sarah in the oak above. Kira at the shelter's entrance. The Tanuki trio in the clearing. Kin at his usual position on the shelter roof. Jin with Nix. He sat down across from Mira and read the document. The administrator's determination ran 6 pages. The first 4 established the procedural record and the Section 17 analysis, which was detailed and careful and in every relevant point aligned with what Shibata had prepared and Issei had argued. The 5th page contained the determination. The heritage designation applied to Chio under the pre-amendment criteria in effect at the time of her family's community registration was valid and remained valid under applicable precedent. The Council's post-amendment reinterpretation could not be applied retroactively to established members. The 6th page addressed remedy. The resource access was to be restored within 30 days. The housing subsidy was to be restored and backdated to the point of its removal, with a formal accounting to be provided to Chio within 60 days. The community school was required to formally admit Hannah and to develop, within 90 days, an accommodation plan for students with non-human characteristics. The final paragraph noted, in the careful language of administrative determinations, that the Council's leadership had a responsibility to review its internal procedures to ensure that similar cases were processed in accordance with stated purpose, and that the Regional Administrator's Office would conduct a review of the case management practices at issue within the following 6 months. He set the document down. The clearing was very quiet. The backdated subsidy, he said. 3 years. A significant sum, Mira said. Enough to change the material circumstances substantially. He thought about the apartment's wall of case documentation. About the organization of a space serving as both home and legal defense for 3 years. About Chio's precise movements and the specific upkeep of someone managing stability as a protective practice. I need to tell her, he said. She has already been notified through the administrator's formal channel, Mira said. But yes. A call from the steward is appropriate. He called her from the clearing, with the spring canopy above him and the map warm in his mind, and she answered before the second ring in a way that told him she had been holding the phone. I read it, she said, before he could speak. Yes. A silence. The school has 90 days to develop an accommodation plan, he said. If they need guidance on what appropriate accommodation looks like for mixed heritage children, Kamaribi can provide that. We have people here with relevant experience. Another silence, this one with a different quality. Hannah asked about the forest again this morning, Chio said. Before school. She wanted to know if the beetle would be there. Mori is always there, he said. We'll come Saturday, Chio said. If that's all right. Saturday is good, he said. The Saturday mornings are when everyone is usually in the clearing. He ended the call and looked up at the canopy. Sarah descended from her position above the shelter and stopped at eye level on the trunk. Well? She said. We won, he said. Varel, from above, made a sound that he had learned was her version of celebration, quick and bright and unguarded. The Tanuki's commentary changed register. Early Morning stood up on her hind legs for a moment, which was, in Tanuki vocabulary, a declaration of opinion, and sat back down. Nix's tail made the long, slow arc. Kira turned from the shelter entrance, and looked at him with the hawk precision of her full attention. The school design, she said. 90 days for the accommodation plan, he said. That's not enough time for the full build. But it's enough time to have a conversation about what the long-term infrastructure should look like. I have been drawing the full design for 3 weeks, she said. It was said simply, not as a claim but as a fact. I can have a preliminary presentation ready in 10 days. He looked at her, at the structural engineering book under her arm and the amber wings that had stopped being concealed at the territory's boundary about 6 weeks ago, and were now simply part of how she moved through the world here, folded or extended as the balance and the mood required. 10 days, he said. I'll be there. Chapter 40. Hannah in the clearing. Hannah arrived on Saturday morning with her mother at 9:30, which was within the window when the clearing was at its fullest. Morning routines overlapping before the day's separate activities dispersed the network to its various occupations. She walked through the forest boundary beside Chio with the 7-year-old's combination of cautious and completely unguarded that was one of the more honest kinds of attention any person could bring to a new place. She noticed everything. The root architecture, which she stepped over with careful precision. The quality of the light through the canopy, which caused her to stop walking for a moment and look up. The camphor tree, which she looked at for a long time before continuing. Issei met them at the clearing's edge. Hannah looked at him. She looked at his shoulder. Mori was there, as it always was. That's the beetle, she said. That's Mori, he said. She approached with the specific caution of someone who had been taught to be careful of things she wanted not to frighten away, and she stopped 2 feet from him and looked at Mori with her luminescence fully present, the corners of her eyes lit in the warm gold that she had been concealing in public since she was 5. Mori's antennae turned toward her. Hannah's breath caught slightly, the small surprised sound of something connecting. It sees me, she said. Yes, he said. Does it know I'm here? It knows. The gear maps everyone in the territory. Mori is part of the gear, in a way. It knows you. She considered this. Am I in the territory? You are right now. The territory goes, he paused, letting the map show him the boundary in the direction she had come from, about 200 meters in every direction from this tree. She looked at the camphor tree. She had been looking at it every few seconds since she entered the clearing, in the way children looked at things that were registering in a part of their perception that their vocabulary had not yet fully caught up with. It's old, she said. About 1,000 years. She absorbed this. Is it sleeping? No. It's very awake. It just moves at a different speed than we do. She walked to the root nearest the tree's base and put her hand against the bark, not tentatively but with the directness of a child who had decided to do a thing and was doing it. The gears showed him what the tree showed her, which was a gentle version of what it had shown him in September, not the full archive, just the warmth of a presence registering another presence, the specific acknowledgement of something old recognizing something young and finding the recognition good. Hannah took her hand off the bark and turned to look at him with her eyes fully open, luminescence bright and unguarded and entirely herself. It said hello, she said. I know, he said. She turned back to the clearing, where Kage had emerged from the burrow and was regarding her with the amber-eyed attention of an ancient tanuki encountering something new. Kira was at the shelter's entrance, her wings half extended in the casual posture she used when she was not consciously thinking about her wings, which had become more frequent over the past months. The kitsune were at their sunbeam. Nyx was at her root. Chio stood at the clearing's edge and watched her daughter in the forest and said nothing, which was the nothing that contained everything. Hannah looked at Kira. She looked at the wings for a long moment with the specific quality of attention that children brought to things they needed to look at directly because looking directly was the only honest response. You have wings, Hannah said. Yes, Kira said. I have light, Hannah said, and touched the corner of her own eye where the luminescence lived, in the most direct and complete introduction he had ever heard a 7-year-old give. Kira's expression did something that he had not seen it do before, a quality of recognition that went past the tactical and the architectural and the 7 years of moving and landed somewhere that was purely personal. I know, Kira said. I can see it from here. Hannah walked into the clearing. Kage watched her approach with the patience of something that had been in this clearing long enough to have seen many first mornings, and knew their quality. She stopped a few feet away and looked at the tanuki with the same full, direct attention she had given everything since she walked through the boundary. You're a tanuki, she said. Kage's tail moved once. Hannah sat down on the ground in front of the tanuki, cross-legged, at its eye level, and they regarded each other with the mutual gravity of a first introduction being conducted with complete seriousness. He stood at the clearing's edge and watched and let the map register the new warmth of a presence that had not been in the territory before, young and bright and entirely itself, the luminescence no longer concealed, the specific quality of a child in a place where the cost of being yourself had just gone down. Chio came and stood beside him. She did not speak for a long time. She hasn't let the glamour down voluntarily in a public place in 2 years, she said finally. This is not a public place, he said. Not in that sense. No, Chio said. It isn't. They stood together at the clearing's edge, and the morning went on around them, the territory full of its own life and its own warmth, the light through the leaves arriving in the way it always arrived, from 100 angles at once, from every direction simultaneously. Kamaribi. The clearing held what it held. The map was warm and full and wider than it had been on any previous morning, wider not in space but in the dimension that mattered most, the one that measured what things were willing to be here, given the ground. Early morning emerged from the burrow and looked at Hannah with the brightness of a young tanuki who had decided this was interesting, and Hannah laughed the completely unguarded laugh of a child who had forgotten to be careful. And the sound of it went up through the leaves and into the canopy where Ten was watching with the hawk's cold clear attention and was, in its way, noting the morning as the kind of morning that warranted notation. Chapter 41. The School Design. Kira's 10-day deadline was not a figure of speech. She presented the preliminary design on the morning of the 10th day in the shelter's cleared space with the prototype in its northeast corner, and a series of hand-drawn plans laid out on the table with the precision she brought to all her work, every measurement notated, every material choice annotated with the reasoning behind it. He had invited Mira, because the school's function overlapped with Kamaribi's institutional development in ways that required Myra's historical and administrative perspective. He had invited Rias, because the school would eventually require resources beyond what the territory currently had access to, and because Rias had been, since the spring began, spending more time in the forest and engaging more actively with the territory's projects in the way of someone who had made a decision and was acting on it. He had not invited anyone else. This was Kira's presentation. The territory's principle was that things developed at their own pace and were introduced to the wider community when they were ready, not when they were impressive enough to withstand a committee. Kira stood at the plans with the hawk calm she had when she was doing something she had been building toward and knew she was ready for it. The design is organized around 3 principles, she said. The first is sight lines. Every learning space is oriented so that children of different physical configurations can all see the same thing at the same time without any of them being required to position themselves in a way that conceals or strains their non-human characteristics. The second is material honesty. The building uses materials that acknowledge what they are. Wood grain visible, not painted over. Stone used where stone is structurally appropriate, not as decoration. This is pedagogically deliberate. Children who are learning to be honest about what they are should be in spaces that model that honesty. She paused and looked at the plans with the evaluator's eye she always turned on her own work. The third principle is the one Sarah contributed, she said. The structural load is distributed through the building's whole system rather than concentrated at conventional support points. This means no single element is bearing a weight it cannot share. The building holds itself together through mutual reinforcement rather than through hierarchy. A pause. Sarah said that was a good principle for a school. I agree. Rias was looking at the plans with her full attention, the expression she wore when encountering something that was reorganizing an internal framework. Scale, she said. First phase, 15 children. The building's structural system can be expanded in modular additions without disrupting the primary load distribution. The design scales to 40 children without structural revision, and to 60 with a planned Western addition. Kira pointed to the relevant section of the plan. The site northeast of the shelter has the correct orientation and sufficient drainage. Sarah has already assessed the soil. Timeline, Mira said. Foundation work and primary structure, 6 months if materials are sourced locally. Another 3 months for interior fitting and accommodation infrastructure. First phase operational and approximately 9 months from groundbreaking. That is aggressive, Mira said. It is achievable, Kira said, with the quality she had when a calculation was complete and the conclusion was certain. I have priced the materials through the Co-Supernatural Trade Network. The sourcing is available. The labor question is the variable. I can address the labor question, Rias said, and there was in her voice the specific register of someone who had made a decision they had been approaching for several weeks and had now arrived at. Everyone looked at her. The Gremery family has construction resources and a network that includes entities with relevant non-standard building experience, she said. I have been considering for some time how to align those resources with Kamaribi's development in a way that respects the territory's independence. A school with neutral standing that serves mixed heritage children is a project I can support without creating a political obligation in either direction. The support would be material and logistical, not governing. You want to fund the school, he said. I want to contribute to the school, she said carefully, in a way that is consistent with what the school is, which is a Kamaribi project. My family's resources are a tool. How the tool is used is yours and Kira's determination. He looked at Kira. Kira looked at the plans for a moment. The contribution would be accepted with gratitude, and without structural obligation, she said. And I would ask to have final authority over material choices and construction decisions. The building is the curriculum as much as what happens inside it. Agreed, Rias said. He sat with the weight of what the room contained. Kira's plans on the table. Rias's commitment. Myra's institutional knowledge already forming the administrative shape of how the school would be registered. He could see it in the angle of her attention. The prototype in the corner, its sight lines clear and its joinery honest. 9 months, he said. 9 months, Kira confirmed. He thought about Hannah in the clearing 10 days ago, sitting cross-legged in front of Kaga with her luminescence fully out, the completely unguarded laugh going up through the leaves. Groundbreaking in June, he said. We'll have a full spring and summer to get the foundation right. Kira folded her hands with the precision of someone closing one phase and opening the next. June, she said. Chapter 42, What the Territory Becomes. May deepened into the fullness of spring and the territory moved with it, the biological pace of the root network at its annual peak, the camphor tree's communication coming through with a clarity and richness that he had not experienced before because he had not experienced its spring before, and the spring clarity was different in kind from the winter clarity, denser with information, more layered. The map was larger than it had been in September in every direction, not just geographically. The territory's perimeter had not significantly expanded. What had expanded was its depth, the density of connection within it, the number of distinct presences, and the quality of the relationships between them. The Hawk family had created their own sub-network, TEN's aerial awareness feeding into the main map through a channel that was different from the biological communions of the other members. Raida and Varel had established an Arachne working relationship with Sarah that had begun to produce structural and material innovations that none of them had developed separately, a collaborative intelligence emerging from the combination of three long-separated intelligences reunited on shared ground. Mira and Nyx's quiet parallel mornings in the shelter had developed into something that he had not been able to name, and had eventually stopped trying to name. A specific kind of companionship between two people who had been carrying very different versions of the same kind of weight for very different lengths of time and had found, in each other's company, the specific rest that came from being understood at the level of that weight without having to explain it. Kira was in the forest every morning now, not always in the clearing, sometimes in the northeast section where the school site was being prepared, moving through the spaces between the trees with her structural eye continuously active, making assessments and notations and returning to the plans with revisions that improved them in ways she could only have found by inhabiting the space rather than mapping it from a distance. Rias came on Sundays and sometimes on Tuesdays and occasionally, he noted, on evenings when the clubroom's particular political atmosphere had been heavy and the forest offered something the clubroom could not. She had developed a specific spot on the clearing's eastern route that was, without formal designation, hers in the way that Nyx's route was Nyx's route and Sarah's oak was Sarah's oak, the territory organizing itself around presence through the simple process of things being true. On one of those evenings in mid-May, she arrived when the light was going and sat on her route, and said, Serzex wants to visit again. When? Next month. He's interested in the school project specifically. The concept of Kamaribi-adjacent educational infrastructure with neutral standing has apparently circulated further than we anticipated. Who has it reached? The Underworld's Educational Policy Division has noted it. There is also informal interest from two Angel faction educational entities who have been looking for neutral standing infrastructure that could serve students from multiple traditions without requiring faction affiliation. He thought about Drake's words from December. Territory with standing changes the structure within which all sanctuaries operate. He thought about Kira's third design principle. The building holds itself together through mutual reinforcement rather than through hierarchy. The school is Kira's project, he said. Any involvement from outside entities goes through her design authority and mine. The school's principles are not negotiable in exchange for resources. I know, Rias said. Serzex knows. That is part of what makes the interest genuine rather than instrumental. She looked at the canopy. There is something else. 2 more cases have been referred to Kamaribi this week. One through Myra's network, one through Shibata's notation in the Chio decision. The second case involves parties from 2 different factions. 2 different factions means 2 different legal frameworks applying to the dispute, he said. Yes. It is significantly more complex than either previous case. Is it within Section 17's scope? Mira believes there is a Section 17 argument available. It is not clean. It will require developing the argument as we go rather than from a prepared position. He thought about what Mira had said about taking hard cases before feeling fully ready. He thought about the case register in the shelter, 2 entries, one for the Gore Tanaka resolution and one for Chio's heritage determination, the beginning of an archive. Tell her to brief me tomorrow, he said. Already scheduled, Rias said, and there was something in her voice that he recognized as the register she used when she was proud of something and was expressing it in the characteristic Rias way, through the calm acknowledgement of its already done status rather than through the performance of it. He turned to look at her. She was looking at the canopy where the last light was moving through the spring leaves in the specific pattern. She had her coat around her shoulders against the evening coolness, and her hair was slightly loose from whatever arrangement it had been in that morning, and she was entirely present, without the social architecture, simply here. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him. "For what?" "For the Sunday mornings. For Sursex. For coming on evenings when the clubroom is heavy. For understanding, from the beginning, that protecting something means trusting it." She was quiet for a moment. "You trusted me to understand that," she said. "That was yours." The evening settled into its darkness around them, the territory's nighttime sounds beginning, the network warm and complete in the map, and the two of them on the eastern route in the space that was theirs and was also the forest's and was also older than either of them and would outlast both and was, in that permanence, exactly the right context for the things that mattered most. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. She was still there when the stars came out. Chapter 43, The Map as It Stands. June arrived. Groundbreaking for the school was on a Saturday morning, which was the morning with the highest natural gathering in the clearing, and the gathering was, for the first time, more than the territory's resident network. Chio and Hannah were there. Hannah in the clearing with Kage, an early morning with the ease of a child who had spent 3 consecutive Saturday mornings building an increasingly complex relationship with 2 Tanukis and was now on terms that the Tanuki governance system apparently recognized as the visitor of standing category, distinct from the general visitor category and with specific privileges that he had not been able to fully decode but that seemed to involve proximity to the borough. Entrance. Shibata had come, not as a formal party but as himself, a Kappa in his mid-career standing who had been watching this territory for 9 months and had decided that watching was no longer sufficient. He sat at the shelter's table with his customary tea and his customary careful questions, and he was, for the first time in the months he had been observing from a distance, simply present without a professional intermediary function. Sarah, Raide, and Varel were in the canopy together, which they increasingly were, the 3 of them working in the collaborative way their reunited intelligence had developed, and their presence above the clearing had the quality of a ceiling that was also a sky. Mira was at the table with Shibata, and the conversation between them had the quality of 2 people who had been operating in the same landscape from different positions for a long time and were finding, in the specific context of Kamaribi, the common ground that the landscape itself had not previously provided. Kira was at the school's site. He walked to the northeast section through the morning forest, past the camphor tree whose roots ran beneath his feet in every direction, past the drainage channel where the water was cleanest at this time of year, through the stand of younger oaks that Kira had assessed and found structurally sound enough to leave standing rather than clear, because the school's design incorporated the existing trees rather than displacing them. The school site was cleared and leveled, the work of the past 3 weeks visible in the ground's preparation. The drainage channels Kira had insisted on despite their being underground and invisible, the soil composition adjusted in 3 areas where the root network's density required accommodation rather than competition. Kira was standing in the center of the site with her plans in her hands and her wings fully out in the morning air. She was doing the thing she did before beginning construction on any section, standing in the space and letting the space tell her what it needed before she imposed what she intended. He stood at the site's edge and waited. She turned after a few minutes and looked at him. "Ready," she said. "Then let's begin," he said. The groundbreaking was not ceremonial. There was no speech. Kira placed the first marker stake, and he placed the second, and the work began in the direct way that the territory had always worked, from the thing that needed doing toward the thing that would be, without performance of the transition. He came back to the clearing in the mid-morning and stood at its center with the map fully present. All of it. The root network below him, running in every direction, the camphor tree at the center communicating in its layered spring mode, full and complex and patient. The hawk family in the canopy, 10 in the highest branch watching the morning's movements with the accumulated intelligence of a lifetime of watching. The 3 arachni working above in the collaborative mode that was producing things none of them had made separately. Mori on his shoulder, navigating, always navigating. Kage and Kaze in the burrow or in the clearing or in some Tanuki negotiation that was ongoing and probably would not resolve. Early morning bright and direct and certain of her positions. Kin on the shelter roof in the habitual morning spot. Jin with Nyx at the eastern route. Nyx looking at the canopy with the specific contemplation she brought to mornings. Hana with the Tanukis, her luminescence fully out. Kira at the school site, placing stakes. Mira and Shibata at the table, building the institutional language for the second case. Rias, not here this morning because it was a Saturday of specific obligations, but present in the map's warmth the way things were present that had become part of the territory's fundamental character. He thought about September. A beetle on a ruined courtyard tile. A gear he did not understand. A forest at the edge of everything that the city had not gotten around to. He thought about what Mira had said about the old territories. The community made each person more themselves, not less. He thought about Nyx's mother's community and its teaching. The ritual was the tending. He thought about the camphor tree's 1,000-year patience, and the 1,500-year dormancy, and the morning it had chosen to resume. He pressed his palm to the nearest root. The warmth that came back was the warmth of the whole network, all of it at once, the beetle and the ancient hawk and the 3 reunited Arachne and the Lamia who had converted loss into knowledge and the Chimera who had converted movement into architecture and the Nephilim who had converted 12 centuries of exile into the precise institutional understanding of what should exist and did not, and the Tanukis, who had simply been here, and the Kitsune, who had decided this was the correct location for their afternoon rest, and the child who had put her hand against the bark and said it said hello. All of it. Present. Chosen. Real. He stayed with his palm on the root for a long time, in the spring morning, in the territory that was a resumption and a continuation and a beginning, and let the map be as full as it was. There was more to come. He knew that clearly. The 2 new cases, and whatever cases followed. The school in 9 months and the children who would come to it, and the things that would need to be built and rebuilt and maintained and tended. The political landscape that would continue to shift and the factions that would continue to assess Kamaribi as it grew, and the conversations that would need to be had and the positions that would need to be held. The second generation of the territory and the third. The things he did not yet know needed to exist. There was more to come and he was, in this specific morning, exactly at the beginning of it. Mori's antennae moved against his neck in the small motion that meant the survey was complete, and everything was in its place. He stood up. He went back to the clearing. Hannah looked up from her conversation with early morning and waved at him, the completely unself-conscious wave of a child who had decided he was someone she waved at. He waved back. The territory went about its morning. Chapter 44, The Cross-Faction Case. The second case had been waiting in Myra's intake notes for 3 weeks before they could give it the full attention it required, because the Chio matter had consumed resources at every level and the territory's principle about not overextending its operational capacity was a principle Mira enforced with the same precision she brought to everything. She had said the week after the administrator's decision, "We take the next case when we have completed the institutional learning from this one and not before." The register is not a trophy cabinet. It is a working document. The learning from each case is what makes the next one survivable. He had spent 2 weeks doing the learning. Rereading the Chio case record from the beginning. Writing a long document for the register that analyzed what had worked, and what had been improvised, and what needed to be built as standing infrastructure before they encountered the same pattern again. Talking with Mira about Section 17's limits, and the cases where its 3 conditions would not apply cleanly. Talking with Shibata, now a regular if unofficial presence at the territory's working table, about the Yukai Council's internal response to the administrator's decision, which had been the specific combination of public compliance and private resentment that characterized institutions that had been checked but not changed. Then they opened the second case. It involved 2 parties. The first was a low-rank devil family named Hosoya operating in the eastern underworld territories, whose patriarch had died 3 months ago, leaving a contested estate that included a resource claim in a border zone between devil-claimed and angel-claimed territory. The second was a seraph-class angel named Castellan who had been designated by the heavenly faction as the administrator of that same border zone, and who claimed that the estate's resource claim was void because it had been established during a period when the border zone's status was disputed and the Hosoya family had no valid claim to resources in disputed territory. The complication was not the legal question, which was genuinely complex but soluble. The complication was the community that had been living in the border zone for 40 years, supporting itself partly through the resource network that the Hosoya claim and the Castellan administration were between them threatening to shut down from opposite directions. The community was small, approximately 60 households, and it was exactly the kind of mixed heritage community that fell through every factional category. Too many angel descendants to qualify for devil community protections, too many devil descendants to qualify for heavenly welfare structures, and too physically distant from any Yukai Council jurisdiction for that framework to be applicable. He read the intake summary twice and then looked at the attached map of the border zone, and then looked at Mira. 2 factions, he said. 2 factions, she confirmed. Castellan is Seraph class. That's above Rias's standing. Castellan is Seraph class and has been the border zone administrator for 11 years and is, according to my contacts in the Angel faction's administrative structure, someone who has been advocating internally for exactly the kind of neutral facilitation infrastructure that Kamaribi represents. The dispute with the Hosoya estate is not personal. It is positional. She holds a position that requires her to defend a claim even if she would personally prefer to resolve it. He absorbed this. She wants to find a resolution. She cannot be seen to want it, given her role. She cannot be seen to want it in a way that concedes the factional position. She can, however, accept neutral facilitation without conceding anything, because neutral facilitation does not require either party to move their stated position in order to begin the process. Mira paused. This is actually the advantage of our framework in cross-faction cases. We don't ask either party to soften their position to participate. We ask them to agree to a process that might find an outcome neither position anticipated. And the Hosoya family? The patriarch's heir is a woman named Yum, 23 years old, who has been managing the estate's legal affairs since her father's death while simultaneously managing her own grief, which the estate's lawyers appear not to have factored into their interaction strategy. Myra's voice had the even quality it maintained when describing situations that contained injustice and required professional distance to address effectively. She is not difficult. She is exhausted and she is being managed rather than heard. He thought about Chio's apartment wall. About the color-coded case timeline. We contact him first, he said. Not the lawyers. Her directly. Agreed, Mira said. And I will contact Castellan through a channel she can receive without its becoming part of the official record until both parties have confirmed willingness to participate. Do you have that channel? I have been building channels for 12 centuries, Mira said. I have that channel. Chapter 45, Yum. He met Yum at a restaurant in the commercial district of the eastern underworld city where the Hosoya estate had its administrative office, which was accessible via the Devil Faction Transit Network and was therefore a 4-hour round trip from Ko that he had scheduled between school and the evening's territory work. He went alone again. The pattern was establishing itself. Mira handled the complex parties and the institutional contacts. He handled the people who needed to be met as people rather than as parties. The distinction was not about status. It was about what the meeting required. Yum was already at the table when he arrived, 20 minutes early in the way of someone who had learned that controlling arrival time was one of the few variables available to manage when most of the other variables were not. She was young in a way that the devil longevity made contextually complex, 23 years by chronology, but carrying the compressed experience of someone who had been managing adult responsibilities for longer than that, first in the background of her father's estate operations and then, since the death, in full. She had dark eyes with the specific quality of attention that came from being accustomed to reading situations that other people were managing for their own purposes rather than for hers. She looked at him and said, "You're younger than I expected." "I get that often," he said. "Are you managing the estate's lawyers, or are they managing you?" She blinked. It was the blink of someone who had not been asked the actual question in 3 months. "They are very good at their jobs," she said carefully. "That's not what I asked?" A pause. They are managing me, she said. In the sense that the strategy has been constructed around the legal position without much input from me about what outcome I actually want. What outcome do you actually want? She looked at the table for a moment. The border's own community has been living on that resource network for 40 years. My father knew most of the households there. He was not, a brief pause with something in it, a person who would have wanted the estate's legal position to be the mechanism by which 60 households lost their resource access. She looked up. But the legal position is what it is, and the lawyers say we cannot concede it without exposing the entire estate to other challenges. The lawyers are right that you cannot concede the position, he said. They are wrong that conceding the position is the only way to reach an outcome where the community keeps its resource access. Those are different problems. The legal position and the community's welfare are not actually in conflict. They are being handled as if they are because the existing framework does not have a mechanism that addresses both simultaneously. Kamaribi's facilitation, she said. She had read the intake materials he had sent. He had expected that. Kamaribi's facilitation, he confirmed. Neither you nor Castellan would be conceding anything by participating. The process is designed to find an outcome that neither party's stated position excludes but that neither party can reach by negotiating directly because direct negotiation requires positional movement that both parties have reasons not to make. She was quiet for a moment. My father used to say, she said slowly, that the most expensive disputes were the ones where both parties were defending positions they had already privately moved past but couldn't say so. She looked at him. He would have found this interesting. I think he would have, Issei said. She looked at the table again, and then at the window, and then back at him with the quality of someone who had made a decision, and was acknowledging it rather than announcing it. What do you need from me? A letter of participation addressed to Kamaribi's facilitation office. Your lawyers can review it. The letter commits you to the process, not to any outcome, and it includes a standard neutrality acknowledgement that is boilerplate, and does not affect the estate's legal position. How long is the process? I don't know. The Chio case took 11 days once both parties were at the table. This case is more complex. Estimate 6 weeks for the initial phase, with extension provisions if the outcome requires additional documentation. 6 weeks from when? From when Castellan's participation letter arrives, which I expect within 10 days of my next meeting. Yum looked at him one more time with those dark reading eyes. You've already contacted her. Not yet. But the contact will be made today. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh but occupied the specific register between them where exhaustion and something like relief existed simultaneously. Send the participation letter template, she said. I'll review it with the lawyers and return it within 3 days. Thank you, he said. Thank my father, she said. He spent 40 years maintaining that resource network for a reason. He thought about a man who had known the border's own 60 households by name, who had maintained a resource network for 4 decades without treating it as a legal instrument, who had built something that outlasted his own management of it in the way that things rooted in good principle outlasted their builders. He thought, the territory knows this shape. Chapter 46, Castellan. The contact with Castellan went through Mira, as planned, via a channel that was approximately 900 years old and had been used 3 times in Myra's experience, all 3 times for communication that needed to happen without entering the official record until both parties had decided it should. He was not present for the initial contact. Mira had been clear that Castellan's response to the outreach would determine the next step, and that the outreach itself required the specific kind of institutional weight and credibility that Myra's 12th century operational history provided in ways his 17 years of standing, however formally recognized, could not. This is not about your standing, Myra had said, with the precision she used when she wanted something understood rather than heard. Your standing is legitimate and Castellan will know that. This is about register. Castellan is Seraph class and has been operating in the Angel faction's administrative structure for a very long time. The initial contact needs to be made by someone whose experience register she reads as credibly equal to her own before she has decided whether to trust the institution. You're her peer, he said. In terms of operational experience, yes. In terms of standing under current factional hierarchies, no. But the communication happens before the hierarchy is invoked. She paused. Trust is established in the space before formal positions are taken. Once the positions are taken, trust becomes much harder to build. The response came in 4 days, which Mira said was fast for a Seraph-class angel administrator in an active dispute. Castellan's message was brief and precise and communicated several things in its brevity. She was aware of Kamaribi. She had reviewed the Chiyo determination and the Gora Tanaka resolution. She was prepared to consider formal participation subject to verification that the facilitation process was genuinely neutral and that the outcome would not require the heavenly faction to formally acknowledge any aspect of the Hosoya claim. She has 3 conditions, Issei said, reading the message. She has 1 condition phrased 3 ways, Mira said. The condition is genuine neutrality. The 3 phrasings address the 3 ways genuine neutrality can be compromised: through the facilitator's bias, through the process design, and through the outcomes framing. She looked at the message. She is thorough. That is a good sign. He wrote the response himself, which was partly his decision and partly Myra's suggestion, on the grounds that at some point Castellan needed to understand who the steward was rather than relying on Myra's intermediation, and a carefully written response to a specific set of conditions was a better introduction than a meeting where the conditions of the meeting itself had not been established. He addressed each of her 3 conditions directly. He cited Kamaribi's recognition framework and the specific provisions that addressed facilitator neutrality. He cited the Chiyo and Gora Tanaka cases as examples of how process neutrality was maintained in practice. He addressed the outcome framing question directly. Kamaribi's outcomes were framed in terms of what the affected communities needed rather than in terms of which party's position prevailed, and that framing was documented in the case register as a standing commitment. He sent it. Castellan's reply arrived in 2 days. It was a participation letter. Mira read it, and said, she made 1 modification to the template. Which one? She added a clause requesting that the 60-household community be formally acknowledged as a party to the facilitation rather than as the subject of it. They are to have representation at the table. He read this and felt something in the map that was not a new node but was the quality of recognition, the gear's awareness of a principle matching a principle. She's right, he said. She is absolutely right, Mira agreed. The community was the affected party in the Chiyo case, and we treated them as subjects. We were right to resolve the case on their behalf. We should have been more deliberate about bringing them to the table as participants. We add that to the standing protocol, he said. Affected communities are parties, not subjects, going forward. Mira was already writing. He thought about Castellan, a Seraph-class administrator who had been advocating internally for neutral infrastructure while publicly defending a factional position she had privately moved past. He thought about Yum, 23 years old, managing grief and lawyers simultaneously. He thought about 60 households in a border zone that had been living in the gap between 2 factions' claims for 40 years and had not stopped living there. He thought, the best people in any system are the ones who use the system's tools to push the system toward what it was supposed to be. He thought, those people need somewhere to bring the cases the system cannot hold. Chapter 47, The School Rises. The foundation work began in the 2nd week of June and proceeded with the quality of work that was being done correctly rather than quickly, which meant it was slower than a conventional construction timeline and more reliable than any conventional construction outcome would have been. Kira was on site every morning before he arrived and was usually still there when he left. She had developed a working relationship with the 3 Arachne that was unlike any of her other relationships in the territory, collaborative, in the specific way of people who were bringing different, but deeply compatible forms of structural intelligence to a shared problem. Sarah's web engineering and Wraith's materials science and Varel's spatial analysis combined with Kira's synthesis of biological and built structure to produce solutions that none of them could have developed from their individual positions. The Foundation's drainage system was the first example. Standard supernatural building practice used ward-based drainage, magical channels that directed water away from foundations but required maintenance, and occasionally failed under conditions that disrupted magical infrastructure. Kira had proposed instead a physical drainage system based on the root network's own water management principles, gravel beds at specific gradients following the same paths the roots used to move water, working with the existing underground hydrology rather than against it. The system required more initial labor, and no ongoing magical maintenance. Sarah had called it the most sensible approach she had seen a builder take to subterranean water management in approximately 80 years. Rias's construction resources arrived in the third week, a crew of 6 that included 2 individuals with non-standard physical characteristics that the regular supernatural construction networks had treated as complications. A half-giant whose structural strength was genuinely useful in foundation work and who had spent the past 3 decades being hired only for the tasks that required brute force and excluded from the planning that would have made his contribution more than purely physical. And a Kitsune construction specialist with 4 tails who had found Kamaribi through the registry listing and had written a very direct letter to the territory asking if there was relevant work and if the territory was what the registry entry suggested it was. He had written back, yes to both. The half-giant's name was Taro. He arrived with the specific compressed quality of someone who had spent a long time fitting himself into spaces designed for smaller people and was still doing it out of habit. On his first morning at the school site he watched Kira work for approximately 40 minutes and then said, without preamble, "The west corner post is wrong." Kira looked at the post, which she had sighted herself. "How wrong?" 3 degrees off plumb. "The soil composition is different there. I can feel it through my feet." Whoever set the post didn't account for the density variation. He looked at her without apology or aggression, simply with the quality of someone stating a structural fact. "I can reset it." 40 minutes? Kira looked at the post. She looked at the ground around it. She crouched and touched the soil with the precise reading pressure she used when evaluating ground quality. "You're right," she said. "Reset it." Taro reset the post in 35 minutes, which was 5 minutes faster than his estimate, and exactly plumb, which Kira verified with 2 different instruments because she verified everything twice. By the end of the first week, Taro had found and corrected 4 additional errors in the foundation work that would have been minor problems during the initial build and significant problems in the second year. He had also begun to have opinions about the west elevation's window placement, which he expressed to Kira in the same direct non-aggressive mode he used for all structural observations, and which Kira received in the same way she received Sarah's observations, with the immediate practical question of whether the observation was correct, stripped of any defensive response to the challenge. The Kitsune construction specialist's name was Fuse. She arrived with 4 tails and a professional portfolio of 11 completed projects, and a communication style that was direct in the way that very experienced Kitsune were direct, without the performance of indirection that younger Kitsune used as a social lubricant. She assessed the site, reviewed Kira's plans, and said the sight line principle is correct. The implementation on the northern elevation has a blind spot for any student taller than 140 centimeters. It needs a secondary line at 160. Kira revised the plans that evening. She added a note in the margin, T and F review, June 16th. The initials were Taro and Fuse. She had added them to the revision attribution within a week of their arrival. He watched all of this from the territory's daily rhythm without intervening, because the school site was Kira's domain and the territory's principle was that things developed at their own pace, and what was developing here was, in the most direct possible sense, the territory's own logic propagating itself through a new project. People who had been excluded from the processes that would have used their capabilities most fully, brought together in a space that recognized what they were doing. Work that was better than any of them could have done without the others. He mentioned this to Mira on a Thursday evening. She looked at him with the storm-gray eyes that carried their centuries when she let them. "Yes," she said. "That is what it looks like when it works." Chapter 48, The Border Zone. The cross-faction facilitation had its first formal session in the third week of June, held in the shelter because the shelter was Kamaribi's working space and because the territory itself was part of what the facilitation was intended to demonstrate. Yum arrived first, with one lawyer who had been briefed on the neutrality requirements, and who sat to the side with the contained professional attention of someone who was present to advise and not to manage. Castellan arrived 8 minutes later with her own administrative assistant and the specific quality of presence that came from decades of operating at the level where presence itself communicated information. She was tall and composed, and she looked at the silk walls of the shelter and the spring clearing beyond the entrance, and said nothing for a moment. Then she looked at Issei. The tree, she said? Yes, he said. The camphor tree has been here for approximately 1,000 years. The territory standing is rooted in it, in the literal sense. I know what it is, Castellan said. She said it with the quality of someone who had encountered this species of ancient awareness before and recognized its signature. I did not expect to find it in this context. What context did you expect? A more formal setting, she said. Documentation and conference tables and the procedural infrastructure of a dispute resolution institution. We have documentation and a table, he said. The infrastructure is the territory. The territory is designed to hold things that need to be themselves completely. That applies to the facilitation process as much as it applies to the beings who live here. She looked at him with the measuring attention of someone revising an assessment. Your message addressed my conditions accurately, she said. I came expecting to test whether the practice matched the letter. The territory, she looked at the clearing again, is more than the letter. They sat at the table. Mira was present as institutional record and as the process's senior experiential resource. Shibata had asked to attend as an observer and Issei had agreed because Shibata's presence at cross-faction proceedings was a signal from the Yukai Council's administrative structure that the process had independent credibility, and independent credibility served both parties' interests. The community's representative was a woman named Hisako, 70 years old and sharp as anything, who had been elected by the 60 households to speak for them and who had arrived an hour early and was the only person at the table who had not reviewed the process documentation in advance because she had been living the underlying situation for 4 decades and found documentation inadequate to the reality. She looked at the Seraph class administrator, and the Devil Estate heir, and the 17-year-old steward and the 12-century-old Nephilim, and said, I want to be clear about one thing before we begin. Everyone looked at her. My community has been in that border zone for 40 years. We were there before the current administrative framework defined it as a border zone. We built the resource network ourselves, with resources we gathered and managed independently. We have been living in the gap between 2 factions' claims without asking either faction for permission to exist there, because either faction offered it, and we needed to exist. She looked at Castellan. She looked at Yum. I am not asking for either of you to approve our existence retroactively. I am asking for the legal framework to acknowledge a fact that has been true for 40 years. We are there, we sustain ourselves, and what either of you decides about your claims should account for the reality that we are a community and not a resource access point. The table was very quiet. Castellan looked at the community representative for a long moment with an expression that was the specific quality of someone encountering an argument they had been privately making in their own mind, and were now hearing stated by the appropriate person. That, Castellan said carefully, is the framework I have been advocating for internally for 3 years. Yum's hands on the table were very still. My father knew you, she said to Hisako. He talked about your community. He came to the spring gathering every year for 20 years, Hisako said. Until he couldn't travel anymore. We sent flowers when he died. Yum looked at the table for a moment. The facilitation proceeded for 6 hours that day, not because the legal question required 6 hours but because the legal question turned out to be the smallest part of what the session contained. What it contained was 3 parties, each of whom had been operating in isolation with incomplete information about the other 2. Discovering that the information gap had been producing a conflict that was not structurally necessary. Hisako's community had been building its resource network as if both factional claims were hostile, because the absence of acknowledgement had read as hostility. The Hosoya estate had been defending its claim as if the community were a third party whose welfare was separate from the estate's interests, because the lawyers had framed the community as a collateral consideration. Castellan had been defending the heavenly administrative position as if its only alternative was concession to the Hosoya claim, because the framework of 2-party disputes did not naturally generate a third option. Mira said nothing for most of the 6 hours. When she did speak, twice, it was to ask the question that returned the conversation to the actual problem when it had drifted to the legal framing of the actual problem, which were 2 different things. He said nothing for most of the 6 hours either. He read the room the way the gear read a field, watching for the minimum viable support points, the moments where one statement from one party was creating the structural dependency that the other party's next statement would either reinforce or fracture. He said things at those moments. Short things. The questions that clarified rather than redirected, the observations that named what was happening rather than what was being said. At the end of 6 hours, Hisako said, I want to see the framework in writing before I agree to anything. But I think we are close to something that my community can live with. Castellan said, the framework I am willing to consider does not require the heavenly faction to acknowledge the Hosoya claim. It requires us to acknowledge the community's independent standing in the border zone, which we should have done 40 years ago. Yum said, if the community's standing is formally acknowledged, the estate's resource claim is secondary rather than primary. That changes the legal landscape in a way I need my lawyers to review. She looked at Issei. Can we schedule a second session in 2 weeks? Yes, he said. They scheduled it. The parties left. Hisako left last, and she stopped at the shelter entrance and looked at the clearing with the expression of someone who had been negotiating in hostile territory for a long time and had arrived somewhere that was not hostile. The forest, she said. Yes. Your beetle. Mori was on his shoulder, as always. Mori, he said. She looked at the beetle with the specific attention of someone who understood what it meant to carry something small and reliable through a long time of uncertain terrain. Good name, she said, and left. Chapter 49, What Sarah Keeps. He found her in the high oak at midnight on a Wednesday in late June, which was not unusual. Sarah kept late hours by preference and by the nature of Arachne rest rhythms, which were not organized around the sleep-wake cycle of ground-dwelling creatures and which had never fully accommodated to the school term schedule he operated on. What was unusual was that she was not working. She was sitting in the fork of the highest branch with her legs folded and her human half still, and she was looking at the clearing below where the shelter's silk walls caught the moonlight and gave back a faint iridescence. Rytha and Varel were asleep in their respective positions further up the canopy. The forest was in its full summer night mode, warm and dense with sound. He was passing through the clearing on a late return from Koa's commercial district where he had been meeting with the Hosoya Estate's lawyers to review the modified framework before the second session, and he had known she was awake before he entered the clearing because the map had been showing him her wakefulness as a point of active attention rather than the diffuse quality of sleep. He stopped at the base of the oak and looked up. You don't have to come up, she said. Her voice in the dark had the same quality as in the day, dry and precise, but without the social register she applied in group contexts. This was the Sarah that lived in the spaces between the tasks. I know, he said. Are you all right? A pause that was not the usual computation pause but the other kind. I am thinking about something, she said. You are welcome to sit if you want to think in the same space. He sat at the oak's root. Not climbing, not imposing on her altitude. Present at ground level, available if the thinking became something to share. They were quiet for a while. The forest's nighttime vocabulary moved around them. Rytha and Varel, she said eventually. He waited. They have been here 3 months. In those 3 months the three of us have done work that I had not done in 40 years of working alone. She was quiet for a moment. I had accepted, over those 40 years, that the work I was capable of was the work I could do within the limits of solitude. I had built a framework for my life that was coherent and complete within those limits. And now those limits are different, he said. The limits are gone, she said, with the directness she used when precision was more important than softness. That is not the same as different. It requires a recalibration of what I am capable of, and that recalibration is larger than I anticipated. A pause. It is not a complaint. I want to be clear that it is not a complaint. But it is significant, and I am sitting with its significance. He understood this. He had had his own version of it in September, the specific vertigo of a boundary you had organized your life around turning out not to be a boundary, but a limit you had accepted as a boundary. What does the work feel like now? He asked. Not to fill the silence. Because he wanted to know. She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer, and then she said, like speaking a language I have known for a very long time and have only ever had occasion to use at partial vocabulary. Like the full vocabulary is now available and I am still only using the partial version out of habit, and the habit is a thing I have to actively choose to set down rather than a thing that will simply erode over time. The moonlight moved through the canopy in the way moonlight moved through full summer canopies, slower than the spring version, the leaves dense enough to hold it rather than just filter it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "The 40 years. Were they what you would have chosen, if you had had the choice you have now?" A long pause. "No," she said. "But the 40 years made me what I needed to be in order to be here. The work I did alone built a kind of structural integrity in my thinking that the collaborative work is now building on. If I had had this," the small gesture of her hand encompassing the territory below, the shelter, the 3 oaks, "from the beginning, I would not have had the particular kind of depth that 40 years of solitary precision produces." A pause. "I am not grateful for the solitude. But I am honest about what it produced." He thought about Mira, 12 centuries of exile converted into the precise institutional understanding of what should exist and did not. He thought about Nyx, a destroyed community converted into the specific knowledge of how the early pattern looked. He thought about Kira, 7 years of movement converted into an architecture that held children of different natures and spaces designed for their completeness. "The territory collects people who have converted their losses into something useful," he said slowly. "Yes," Sarah said. "Which is why it works. Institutions built on unprocessed loss replicate the loss. Institutions built on converted loss replicate the conversion." He sat with this at the camphor tree's root, at midnight in the full summer forest, and felt the truth of it in the map's warmth, the specific quality of what the territory was made of and what that making produced. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For saying it clearly." She made the blink in sequence expression that he could not see in the dark but could feel in the quality of the silence that followed. "Go home," she said. "You have school in 6 hours." He went home through the summer night and slept with the map warm and the forest sounds still present in the back of his mind, and in the morning the territory was there the way it was always there, full and chosen and itself. Chapter 50. The Second Session and Its Aftermath. The second session ran 4 hours and produced a framework document. The framework was not final. It was a working document, which was the correct status for something that had been built across 2 sessions from the starting point of 3 parties who had been operating with incomplete information about each other. The document addressed 3 things: formal acknowledgement of the border zone community's independent standing as a community rather than as a resource access point, a shared administrative structure for the border zone's resource network that incorporated community governance alongside the 2 factional claims without requiring either factional party to yield its underlying claim, and a process for resolving future disputes that used Kamaribi's facilitation framework rather than returning to the binary structure of 2-party negotiation. The third element had been Hisako's addition, proposed in the second session's 4th hour with the directness of someone who had been living in an unstable situation long enough to understand that stability required a maintenance mechanism rather than a single resolution. "If we fix this and then have no process for the next conflict," Hisako had said, "we are back where we started in 15 years. The next steward of the estate will not have known my community for 40 years. The next border zone administrator will not have Castellan's 3 years of internal advocacy. We need something that holds the framework in place regardless of who the individuals are." Castellan had looked at Mira when Hisako said this. Mira had looked back with the quality of someone who had been watching for this exact moment for about 2 sessions. "What Hisako is describing," Mira said, "is a standing referral agreement between the border zone parties and Kamaribi. It is not a governance structure. It is an access mechanism. Any party to the border zone framework can refer a dispute to Kamaribi's facilitation without requiring the other party's consent to the referral, and Kamaribi commits to accepting referrals within 30 days. That creates an ongoing obligation for Kamaribi," Yum said. "It creates an ongoing function," Issei said. "That is what the territory was built for." The standing referral agreement was added to the framework document. After the session, Castellan came to him at the clearing's edge before departing. "I want to say something directly," she said. "Please," he said. "I have been in the Heavenly Faction's administrative structure for a very long time. In that time I have seen neutral facilitation attempted on 3 occasions. 2 of the 3 failed because the facilitating party was unable to maintain genuine neutrality under pressure from one of the parties. The third succeeded but produced an outcome that the facilitating party then used as a precedent to assert ongoing influence in the region. She looked at him steadily. Kamaribi has done neither of those things. The process has been what you said it would be. That is what the territory is supposed to do, he said. I know. That is why I am saying it to you rather than writing it in a formal evaluation. A pause. A formal evaluation will follow. But I wanted you to hear the actual observation before it is processed into official language. He nodded. She looked at the clearing one more time, at the shelter's silk walls and the camphor tree at the center, and the afternoon light through the summer canopy. How did you know, she said, at 17, to build it this way? He thought about September. About a beetle on a courtyard tile. About a gear that had been waiting for 1200 years not for the right power but for the right willingness. I didn't, he said honestly. The territory showed me what it needed to be. I tried to listen. She looked at him with an expression that was, for a Seraph class administrator, something quite close to what the territory had taught him to call warmth. That, she said, is the correct answer. She left. The forest held its summer afternoon. He stood in the clearing for a long time after she had gone, feeling the map's warmth and the camphor tree's steady signal and the weight of what the territory was becoming. Not what he had made it. What it had made itself, through the choices of the people who had come to it, and the ground that had been waiting for them. Chapter 51, Groundwork. July arrived with the heat that Japanese July carried as a default condition, pressing and humid and reorganizing the forest's daily rhythms so that the early mornings and the evenings were the active hours and the midday was given over to the specific rest that hot things required. The school foundation was complete by mid-July, ahead of Kira's timeline, a fact she noted without satisfaction because she had already revised the wall framing plan twice since June and the timeline advantage would be consumed by the revisions. The revisions were improvements. Taro had found the second structural issue in the eastern elevation's load path and Fuse had identified a window placement problem in the primary learning room that Kira had not caught because it required standing at a height that her wings made easy for Fuse and less natural for Kira's working posture. Both revisions added 2 weeks and made the building better. Kira did not resist the revisions. This was, he thought, one of the things the territory had produced in her that was most valuable and most clearly hers. The ability to receive correct observations about her work without treating them as challenges to her authority over the work. She had arrived in the territory in November with 7 years of moving in her background and a structural intelligence that had been operating without peer review for most of that time. The peer review, when it arrived in the form of Sarah and Taro and Fuse, had been received with the directness of someone who had always wanted it, and had not had it, and was not going to waste it now that it was available. She was, by July, the kind of builder that the territory had always been trying to produce, someone who brought her full capability to the work, received others' capabilities without ego cost, and produced outcomes that exceeded what any individual contribution could have achieved. He walked the school site one morning in mid-July with Kira, doing the weekly reviews she had instituted since the foundation was poured. The western elevation is 3 days ahead, she said, looking at the framing with the evaluator's attention. The eastern elevation is 4 days behind the revised plan because of the load path correction. Net position, 1 day behind overall, which is within acceptable variation. What are you most uncertain about? She pointed to the primary learning room's northeastern corner. The ceiling height in that corner accounts for Taro's working height, which was the right call. But the proportional relationship between that height and the room's footprint is outside anything I have reference examples for. The theory says it should work. I won't be certain until the room is enclosed and I can assess the actual spatial quality. What does Fuse say? That the proportional relationship is unusual and the spatial quality will depend on how the light enters through the revised window placement, and that she has seen unusual proportional relationships work better than conventional ones when the light was handled correctly. A pause. I am treating that as cautiously optimistic. That's the right treatment, he said. She made the small sound that was her version of agreement when the agreement was confident rather than provisional. They stood at the site's edge for a moment in the July morning heat. In 2 months, she said, the walls will be enclosed. In 4 months, the roof. She looked at the framing. In 9 months, what I drew in the notebook will be a building that children walk into. She said it simply, not as an announcement but as a statement of what was true. He heard in it the specific quality of something completing a circuit, the girl who had wanted to build things and spent 7 years moving, now standing at the edge of the building she had designed, watching it become itself. How does it feel? He asked. She thought about it. Not quickly. With the deliberateness she brought to questions that deserved actual answers. Like I understand, she said at last, why the territory works. He looked at her. You built a place where things could become more fully themselves, she said. And I came here as a thing that was moving too fast to become fully anything. And now, she looked at the framing, I am building a place where children can be fully what they are. And the connection between those two things is not metaphorical. It is structural. A pause. The territory built me into someone who could build this. That is what I mean when I say I understand why it works. He stood with that for a long time in the July heat. He thought, the old territories worked like that. The community made each person more themselves, not less. He thought, it is working. Chapter 52, The Things That Held. The border zone framework was finalized in the first week of August. The finalization session lasted 3 hours and produced a document that was, in Myra's assessment, the most structurally sound interfactional community agreement she had seen in the modern supernatural era, which she dated from the post-war settlement as a rough and imperfect boundary. It was structurally sound not because its legal language was elegant, though Castellan's administrative assistant had made it so, but because it had been built from the community's actual situation outward rather than from the factional positions inward. The language was a consequence of the substance rather than a container imposed on it. Hisako signed last, after Castellan and Yum, and she signed with a quality of deliberateness that was not ceremony but was not the absence of ceremony either. It was the deliberateness of someone performing an action that was the culmination of 40 years of a particular kind of work, the work of keeping 60 households in existence, and in coherence in the gap between two factions' claims. After the session, before she left, she sat in the clearing for 20 minutes. She did not speak to anyone. She sat on a root near the camphor tree's base with her hands in her lap and looked at the clearing and the shelter and the oaks and the July afternoon light moving through the leaves and was simply present in the territory with the quality of someone who had been managing so hard for so long that the cessation of the immediate managing had produced a stillness that needed time to settle. He did not approach her. He sat on the other side of the clearing and let the territory do what it did, which was to hold things without requiring anything from them. After 20 minutes, Hisako stood and came to him. Tell me about the school, she said. He told her. He showed her the plans, which he kept a copy of in the shelter's working folder. He told her about Kira and the design principles. He told her about Taro and Fuse and the revisions and the northeast corner's unusual proportional relationship that Fuse was cautiously optimistic about. Hisako listened with the full attention she had brought to the facilitation table. When does it open? February, if the construction stays within the revised timeline. March at the latest. My community has 4 children who need what that school will provide, she said. 3 with non-human characteristics that the standard educational infrastructure cannot accommodate. 1 whose heritage includes both factional lines and who has been attending 2 different schools on alternate days to maintain the appearance of single-faction membership. He looked at her. 4 days Devil School, 3 days Heavenly School, she said. The child is 9. She has been doing this for 2 years. He thought about Hannah, 5 years old, learning to hold a glamour because the space that should have held her completely did not exist. He thought about Kira's design principle. No child should be required to position themselves in a way that conceals or strains their non-human characteristics. The school will have capacity for 15 students in the first phase, he said. 4 places from your community, if you want them, as part of the standing referral agreement. Hisako looked at him for a moment with the quality she brought to significant things. Yes, she said. We want them. She left. The clearing settled. The afternoon birds made their commentary in the summer heat. He sat with the register open on his lap and wrote the new entry. Third case, border zone framework. Standing referral agreement established. School enrollment reservation for students, border zone community. He closed the register. The camphor tree's roots were warm beneath him. Mori navigated its circuit without interruption. The network was full of its afternoon warmth, the familiar distinct presences of the things and people who had chosen to be here. He thought about what Drake had said in April. Trust it the way you told Kira to trust the map. The map already knows. The map knew. Chapter 53, Surzex returns. Surzex came in August for his third visit, and this visit was different from the previous two in a way that he understood before the visit happened. The first had been assessment, the second had been recognition, and the third was something else, something that required a word from a different register than the administrative vocabulary he had been living in for the past year. It was, he thought, the visit of someone who had become, in some way that official records did not capture, connected to a place. Surzex arrived alone. No administrative staff, no records official. He arrived at the forest boundary at 7 in the morning, which was an hour earlier than any of his previous visits, and he was carrying a thermos and wearing the same ordinary coat, and he stood at the boundary for a moment before entering in a way that was itself different, the pause of someone who had come to a place they were glad to return to. The camphor tree registered his entry. The map's warmth shifted in the specific way it shifted when someone arrived who the territory recognized rather than was simply aware of. He met Surzex at the boundary and they walked the territory together for an hour without specific agenda, and the way he walked it with Rias on Sunday mornings, the walking that was the conversation rather than the occasion for conversation. Surzex stopped at the school site. The walls of the primary learning room were framed and partially sheathed, the structure visible enough to read as a building rather than as lumber. Kira was not present this morning, which was one of the 2 mornings a week she spent in the co-commercial library doing material research. Taro was there, working on the eastern elevation secondary bracing with the contained focus of someone who had found their work and was doing it. Surzex looked at the building for a long time. The sightline principle, he said. Kira's design, Issei said. I know. Rias told me. He looked at the northeast corner's unusual ceiling line, visible in the framing. The proportional relationship there is unconventional. Fuse is cautiously optimistic. Fuse has good judgment about spaces. He turned from the building. I want to tell you something about the educational policy interest. Tell me. 3 parties have formally inquired about replicating the Kamaribi school model in other territories. 2 are in the underworld's administrative regions. 1 is in the Angel faction's educational infrastructure. All 3 have resources and standing and genuine interest. He paused. None of them have the territory to put the school in. The school works because it is here, in this ground, with this community. A school building in a different location without the territory's character is a building with good sight lines. The territory's character is not replicable through architecture, Issei said. No. But the architecture can be shared. And the principles can be consulted on. And in some cases, if the territory where the school would be built has the right character to begin with, the Kamaribi model can inform what gets built there in ways that produce something genuinely similar rather than superficially identical. He thought about this. Kamaribi as a consulting resource for other territories trying to build similar educational infrastructure. Kamaribi as a resource that shares what it has learned, Surzex said carefully. Not governing, not franchising. Sharing. The same principle the territory itself operates on. That requires capacity I don't have yet. Yes. It requires the school to be running and to have a year of operational learning before the consulting function begins. Which means you have time to build the capacity. A pause. I am not asking you to commit to anything now. I am making you aware of the landscape so that you can make decisions that account for it. He nodded. They walked back to the clearing. Surzex stopped at the camphor tree and put his hand against the bark again, as he had on both previous visits. He stayed there for longer this time. It is happy, Surzex said. Not a question. Yes, Issei said. I think happy is the right word. Surzex took his hand from the bark and looked at Issei with the expression that appeared in the unguarded moments, when the great Satan layer was not performing its function. You have built something that will outlast you, he said. That is rare. Most things that are built, even by people with the best intentions, are built to last as long as the builder's ambition sustains them. You have built something rooted in ground that was already here. That is a different category of durability. He thought about the camphor tree's dormancy. 1500 years, waiting. The territory's own continuity predating him and postdating him, his stewardship a chapter in something whose first chapter had been written before his lineage existed. The tree was here first, he said. Yes, Sirzek said. And it recognized what you were bringing when you brought it. That is the partnership. Rias arrived mid-morning, as she did most Sundays, and she and Sirzek had a conversation that he was not part of and which took place near the drainage channel at the territory's eastern edge, sibling conversation, the kind that required the specific privacy of people who had known each other for their whole lives and had earned the right to the unguarded version. He sat with the camphor tree and let them have it. When Sirzek left, Rias came and sat beside him on the root. He's proud of you, she said. He told me to tell you. He was going to tell you directly, and then decided it would mean more coming from me. He was right, Issei said. She looked at him sideways with a calibrating warm expression. Yes, she said. He usually is. Chapter 54. The eve of the opening. The school was finished in February. Not a day early, not a day late. Kira had managed the final 3 months with the precision of someone who had accepted that the timeline was what it was and that the correct relationship to a timeline was accuracy rather than optimization. She had built buffers for the things that were uncertain and had not built buffers for the things she was certain about, and the combination had produced a completion date that matched the original estimate she had given in May of the previous year. The northeast corner's unusual proportional relationship had worked. Fuse had been right. The ceiling height in relation to the room's footprint, combined with the revised window placement that brought light in at the specific angle Kira had eventually settled on after 2 months of morning observation of how the forest light moved through the site, produced a quality of space that was, for lack of a better term, honest. It did not try to be more than it was. It held its height and its light without apology and without performance. And the effect of standing in it was the effect of being in a space that was exactly as large as it needed to be. The night before the opening, he walked through the empty building with Kira. She had been doing this every evening for the past week, the final pre-opening ritual of a person who needed to know that what had been built was what she had intended to build. He walked beside her without speaking, letting her have the walk that was hers. She moved through the primary learning room and touched the northeast corner's ceiling height with her eyes and was satisfied. She walked the sight lines from the 3 student positions that covered the full range of student heights and physical configurations the room was designed for. She tested the window's light quality at 3 different points in the room. She stopped in the center of the room. He stopped beside her. They stood in the finished room in the February evening, the last light of the day coming through the correctly placed windows at the angle she had spent 2 months determining was right, and the room was exactly what the plans had described and exactly more than the plans could describe, the specific quality of a built space that had been designed with the intention that the people in it would experience it as being designed for them. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, he said. Hannah is enrolled. Yes. Her mother brought the enrollment form in November. The 9-year-old from the border zone community. Yes. 3 others from the border zone. 2 from the Yukai district who came through Shibata's referral. 4 from families that found Kamaribi through the registry. 3 whose families came to the territory directly after the Chio case was published. 15, she said. 15, he confirmed. She was quiet for a moment. The sight lines work, she said. I know. The northeast corner works. Yes. The building is what I intended. He looked at her. She was looking at the room with the evaluator's eye, the same eye she had been using since November, and the evaluation was complete, and the conclusion was certain, and she was holding the certain conclusion in the way she held certain conclusions, without announcement, simply present with the fact of its truth. You built it, he said. She turned to look at him. In the 7 months since June's groundbreaking, she had changed in ways that the territory always changed things. Not in kind but in degree, more fully herself. The wings were out more consistently now, not the careful half-extension of someone managing their presence but the natural position of someone who had stopped managing and started simply existing. She wore her chimeric nature in the territory the way the shelter wore its silk walls, with the ease of something that had been designed correctly from the first principle and had no need to explain itself. We built it, she said. You designed it. You managed the construction. You solved the northeast corner. Taro found the load path. Fuse found the window placement. Sarah found the drainage principle. Raida found the material for the ceiling treatment that makes the acoustic quality what it is. She paused. I held the design and made the decisions. Everyone else contributed what I couldn't. That's what a designer does, he said. That, she said, is what the territory does. It makes people into what they were trying to be. They walked out of the building together into the February night. The school's exterior was simple, clean lines and honest materials, and the site that Kira had spent the most time on. From the outside, the building read as a place that knew what it was. Not a human building adjusted for non-human use. A building designed from the inside out for the specific reality of the lives it would hold. The forest was quiet around it. The camphor tree's signal was steady and warm in the map. The territory rested in its winter night mode, the network at its lower register, all the presences there but turned inward. Mori was on his shoulder. Tomorrow, Kira said again, looking at the building from outside. Tomorrow, he said, and meant all of it, the building and the 15 children and the morning that would follow this night, and the mornings after that, and the long shape of what the territory was becoming. Chapter 55, Opening Day. The morning arrived with the specific quality that February mornings had in the forest, cold and clear and with a light that came in low through the bare branch sections of the canopy and through the cedars and pines that kept their color, producing a mixture that was less dramatic than the spring's full-leaf patterns but had its own precision, every source of light distinct and legible. Issei was in the clearing by 7. He had been awake since 5:30, which was not anxiety, just the quality of a morning that the map had been reading as significant since the previous night, and that his attention had been orienting toward with the same mechanism it used to orient toward things worth attending to. Kira was at the school building. She had slept there, not inside the building but on the roof, in the specific position she used when she needed to be adjacent to something important without being inside it. He had seen her light on the building's roof at midnight when he made his late check of the territory, and had not said anything about it because there was nothing to say. She was where she needed to be. The network gathered in its morning way. Nyx from the shelter. The Arachne trio from the upper canopy. Mori on his shoulder since he had entered the clearing. The Tanukis in their morning debate. Kin on the shelter roof. Jin beside Nyx. 10 in the highest branch. And then, over the next 2 hours, the others. Rias arrived at 8, dressed for the occasion in the way she dressed when she wanted her presence to carry a specific weight, which was to say simply and without faction markers, the same principle he had used for the council hearing. She sat at the camphor tree's root beside him and took the tea he had made and held it with both hands. Mira arrived at 8:30 with Shibata, who had become a regular presence at significant territorial events in the months since the Chio case, his Kappa pragmatism making his attendance a signal of institutional credibility rather than personal sentiment, though the personal sentiment was also visibly present if you were reading the map. Aquino arrived at 9. She had been coming to the territory more frequently since the spring conversation on the eastern route, and the quality of her presence here had been shifting in the gradual way that the territory shifted things, the social architecture present in smaller proportion each time. She sat on the eastern route with the ease of someone who had found a correct location and was using it. Chio arrived with Hannah at 9:15. Hannah had her school bag, which she had packed herself the previous evening according to Chio's description, with the focused attention of someone who had been looking forward to this for 3 months and had ideas about what belonged in it. She walked into the clearing with her luminescence fully present and went directly to Kage, who was in the clearing in the morning attendance posture, and said good morning in the specific way she said good morning to Kage, which was both a greeting and a report on what had happened since the previous Saturday. The border zone community's 4 children arrived with Hisako, who had made the journey herself rather than delegating it, because some things warranted your own presence. The 9-year-old who had been attending 2 schools on alternate days walked through the forest boundary and stopped and looked at the territory with wide eyes that were simultaneously both her heritages, the specific quality of something that had been held in 2 separate vessels finally in a space large enough to contain both at once. Her name was Emmy. She looked at Hannah, who looked back. Hannah said, "I have light." Emmy said, "I have 2 kinds." Hannah said, "Cool." They went to find early morning together. The other 10 students arrived in 1s and 2s over the next 40 minutes. He knew each of their files from the enrollment process. Mixed heritage children, children whose characteristics fell outside every existing educational category, children who had been managing themselves down to fit spaces that were not built for them. They walked into the clearing with the specific quality of each one, cautious and wondering, and then, as the territory's warmth registered, something in them releasing the specific tension of a child who has been managing their nature as a cost and finding, for the first time, that the cost was not being charged here. Not all of them released it immediately. Some of them held it for the whole morning, the management so habitual that it continued even when the condition that required it was absent. This was, he thought, something the school would work on over months and years, the gentle practice of helping children unlearn the cost. At 10 o'clock, Kira came down from the school roof. She walked to the clearing with her wings fully extended, not in the careful half-extension of indoor spaces, fully extended in the February morning air, the amber membranes catching the cold light. She had dressed for the day with the same considered simplicity she brought to everything, and she carried the school's preliminary operations document under her arm with the ease of someone who had been carrying it mentally for 8 months and had finally gotten to put it on paper. She stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at 15 children and their adults, and the territory's full morning network and the February light through the canopy. He came to stand beside her. "Ready?" he said. "I have been ready since November," she said. The building just had to catch up. He looked at her and thought about a girl with wings in a forest in Co in December, sitting on the boundary stone eating rice crackers for the first time in a long time, asking if she could see the territory before she decided. "You should say something to them," he said. "You built this." "I know what to say," she said, and walked into the clearing. The children gathered. The adults arranged themselves at the edges, the specific position of adults who understood that this morning was for the children rather than for them. Kira stood in the center of the clearing with her wings extended and looked at 15 faces, each one its own particular combination of natures and heritages, and the specific quality of a child in the presence of something new. "This school is yours," she said. Her voice was direct, without ceremony, in the way that things she meant fully came out. "Not mine, not Kamaribi's. Yours. It was built for what you are. All of what you are. You do not have to be smaller here than you are." She paused. "That is the only rule," she said. Hannah's luminescence was very bright. Emmy, beside her, was doing both kinds of light simultaneously, the two heritages producing a combined quality that was entirely its own thing, entirely hers. The camphor tree's signal in the map was the warmth it had had since the recognition, the warmth of a very old patience finding what it had been waiting for, but fuller now than at any previous point, fuller by the specific addition of 15 young lives in a building built for their completeness. The territory held them all. He stood at the clearing's edge with Rias beside him and Aquino on his other side, and the map warm in his mind and the February light doing its precise winter thing through the canopy, and thought, this is what it was waiting for. Not the recognition, not the cases, not the boarder's own framework, or the Phoenix resolution, or any of the specific events of the past 17 months. The children. The school that held them without requiring anything from them but their presence. The building that had been designed from the inside out for the specific reality of the lives it would hold, by a girl with wings who had spent 7 years moving and had arrived here and stopped. Maury was still on his shoulder, where Maury had been since October of last year, and would continue to be, navigating. He pressed his palm to the camphor tree's root, where he was standing, and felt the warmth of the whole territory at once. Everything that had chosen to be here. Everything that was being built. Everything the map had been showing him since September, the shape of it full now and clear, the way a sentence was clear once its last word arrived. He stayed there until the children went into the school. He watched them go. Then he turned to Rias, who was looking at him with the expression he had finally named and had been seeing more clearly since March. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. The forest went about its morning. The school went about its first day. The territory held what it held, which was more than it had ever held before, and which was, in the deepest sense of the word, exactly enough. Chapter 56, Kamaribi. The year turned towards spring again. He stood in the clearing on an early March morning, alone before the network gathered, and felt the territory around him with the particular quality that the second spring had over the first, deeper in the way that second readings of important texts were deeper, not because the material had changed but because the reader had. The school had been in operation for 3 weeks. The adjustment period was real and ongoing, 15 children learning that the territory's principle was not a promise about ease but a change in the cost structure of being themselves, and those were different things that took different amounts of time for different children to understand in their bodies rather than their minds. Hannah had understood it in her body since her first Saturday in October. Emmy was understanding it week by week, the two kinds of light that were hers becoming more simultaneous rather than alternating as the weeks passed, the management habits loosening incrementally. The others were at various points in the same process. Kira was building those points into the curriculum, because the school's curriculum was not external to the school's design but continuous with it. The building and the learning were the same project, both designed from the principle that completeness was not something children needed to earn but something the space could make possible. The case register had 4 entries now. A 5th case was an intake, referred through the standing referral agreement from Castellan's Border Zone Administrative Network. Mira had reviewed it. It was complex and would require 2 months of preparation before the facilitation could begin. The preparation had started. The territory itself had changed in ways that were less dramatic than the school's construction and more fundamental. He could feel it in the map's texture, the quality of the communion network that had been building since September of the previous year. It was denser now, not in the number of presences but in the connections between them, the way a young forest was dense versus an old forest, the young forest trees growing close together for the competition and the old forest trees growing apart from each other but connected at the root level in ways that the canopy did not reveal. The school's students were becoming part of the network in the particular way that young things became part of territories, not through the deliberate communion process that had added the territory's original members but through the simpler and more fundamental mechanism of presence, through being here repeatedly, and allowing the ground to know them and allowing themselves to know the ground. Hannah knew Kage's moods now. She had opinions about them. Emmy had found the drainage channel on her second Saturday and had spent 40 minutes there before Nix came and sat nearby and, without speaking, began demonstrating the floor reading practice that had been one of Nix's first gifts to the territory's founder. He thought, the territory is teaching again. Through the ones who learned it first. Mori completed its morning circuit and returned to his shoulder. Rias arrived at the usual time. He had heard her at the boundary 10 minutes before she appeared, the warmth of her energy signature and the map's perimeter awareness that had become the day's first familiar signal. She sat beside him on the camphor tree's root and accepted the tea and looked at the clearing in its March morning state, the first tentative spring green appearing at the branch tips, the ground beginning its annual return from the winter compression. The second spring, she said. The second spring, he confirmed. It's different. Yes. She looked at the school building, visible through the trees to the northeast, its clean lines and honest materials in the pale morning light. What did Sirzek say last month about the consulting function? That there were 3 territories interested in the school model. That Kamaribi would need a year of operational learning before the consulting could begin. The year starts now, she said. The year started in February. She nodded, the small nod of someone incorporating information into a plan that was already in motion. What do you need? She asked. He thought about it. Not the operational needs, which he could list precisely. The other kind. I need the mornings, he said. This one and the ones after it. The walking and the perimeter and the map. Those are what make everything else possible. She looked at him with the expression he had named and had been seeing very clearly since March of last year. Then you have them, she said simply. The morning went on around them. The network assembled in its daily way. The school received its students. The cases proceeded through their stages. The construction plans that Kira had begun drafting for the Western edition sat in the shelter's working folder, the beginning of a second phase that was still theoretical but had stopped being distant. 10 called from the canopy. The younger hawks answered. The Tanukis had an opinion about something. Hannah arrived with her school bag and went directly to Kage and began her morning report. The camphor tree's roots were warm. Mori navigated. He sat in the second spring of his territory, in the specific light that named it, the light that came through leaves from 100 angles at once, each angle distinct, each angle contributing something the others did not, and the combination producing not a single illumination but a field of presence, warm and multiple and entirely itself. Kamaribi, the light through leaves. The territory that was a continuation and a resumption and a beginning. The place where things came to be what they were. He was its steward. He was 17 years old and a devil's pawn and the holder of 2 sacred gears that the classification systems had not fully caught up with, and the builder of something that would outlast all of those designations. He was also, more simply and more completely, here. The morning was good. The map was full. The territory went about its day. End of Act 5. End of The Monster King of Kuo.